includes lawyers that have tried to talk their way out of trouble. He can't do this. And if he does, it will be against every single lawyer that's ever advised him.
All right. Judge Jeff Swartz, good to see you. Thanks so much.
Have a nice day.
You too.
And we're back now with our top source tonight, former Trump White House aide Cassidy Hutchinson. And Cassidy, we were just talking about the immunity case and what that means. Trump is also going to be in court tomorrow back in New York in the criminal hush money case. He's been facing, accusations from the prosecutors that he violated the gag order. It seems pretty black and white that he did violate the gag order, but we're waiting on the judge to decide. And the emphasis has been he's just been attacking witnesses nonstop. And as someone who has been personally attacked by Donald Trump, what's the impact that has on your life?
I mean, in short, it's tremendous, and it's something that I think we have to take really seriously, and other witnesses coming forward have to take really seriously. I was really fortunate that when I made the decision to come forward and comply fully with the January 6th committee, that I was surrounded by a team of lawyers and advisors that really insulated and protected me. I knew what I was getting myself into when I left the Trump world, and regrettably, I knew that because I had once been part of that playbook. I know how they attack the people who they feel most threatened by, and they will do whatever means necessary to take them down and ruin their reputation and their image in the name of promoting Donald Trump. It's been difficult for me at points, and I wouldn't be honest with your viewers if I said otherwise. I have hard days still. But I think about other witnesses like Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, whose lives were upended during the 2020 election. I think about Rusty Bowers. I think about Brian Butler, who courageously came forward with you a couple of weeks ago, and he was interviewed in the Mar-a-Lago case, worked for Trump at Mar-a-Lago. He came forward now because he believes that the information that he has is really important for the American people to know and understand. That takes courage, because you do know that there are going to be negative impacts on your security situation, your potential future job prospects, people coming after you publicly, but also for your family. And that's, I think about people like that who don't have the resources, or they don't have the ability to protect themselves. When we talk about Donald Trump's how he's completely devoid of any leadership quality, that right there tells you who Donald Trump is. He wages attacks on the American people.
I'm so glad you brought up Brian Butler, because he's the former Mar-a-Lago employee who's now a witness in the classified documents investigation, kind of similar to a lot of people who work for Trump and then wind up in these investigations. And we asked about the impact that coming forward has, and this is what he told us about his concerns. Why are you speaking out publicly with your story now?
Instead of just waiting for this to come out, I think it's better that I get to at least say what happened than it coming out in the news, people calling me crazy. I'd rather just get it out there, and the hope is that at least I can move on with my life and get over this.
I mean, he kind of felt similar to how you do.
I have goosebumps being here. I remember watching the interview the night that it aired, and it takes, at this point, it takes a lot to get me very emotional about some of the shortcomings of Trump world, just because at this point I expect a lot of it. But seeing him speak with you so candidly and openly about what he's gone through, how his decision process played out, but also how it was a difficult one. He did turn away from his friends in order to do the right thing. I hold him in really high regard, and I think that he's extremely courageous for doing what he did. And I think the American people owe him a thank you for that.
Yeah, he's lost friends over this. A co-conspirator of Trump's, a co-defendant, was one of his best friends. When you look at all of this, and as the judge in New York is deciding how to respond to Trump's, alleged violations of the gag order, is there anything that would hold him accountable for his attacks on these witnesses and even commenting on the jury?
I would like to say yes, but Donald Trump is going to leverage whatever the judge decides and use it as an opportunity to make himself a martyr in the situation. He's going to try to continue, in my view, stealing money from hardworking American people by fundraising off of this, by lying to them, and by spreading conspiracy theories, by playing on their greatest anxieties and fears, so he can win again, and so he can stay in power and potentially not have to go to prison for the rest of his life, because that's the reality of what he's facing. But when we talk about how to adequately handle it, it's really difficult. I think sometimes if sending him to prison is the right thing. Can you really limit his speech? I can't comment on the nuances of all of that. I think the greatest stride that we can take towards holding him accountable, though, is in this next election cycle, making sure that he never gets near the Oval Office again. But in the process of leading up to that, really talking to the American people about who he actually is.
He said that he questioned, I should say, whether you should be prosecuted because of a Secret Service agent who could not corroborate your testimony of something that you said you were told by the White House, Deputy Chief of Operations at the time, Tony Ornato, and he's gone after you publicly as you've spoken out bravely. I wonder if seeing him attack these other witnesses right now as this case is going on, how does that make you feel about potentially having to be a witness in a Trump trial one day?
It depends on the day. Some days I feel like I've gone through the worst, and I kind of know what to expect at this point, but then a day will happen where you realize it probably can get worse. I try not to lament too much on hypotheticals of what could or could not happen. I would expect, I can't say it definitively, but I would expect at some point, if these investigations continue to be called as a witness, and again, I would comply fully, willingly, and faithfully, because I believe that's my duty as an American citizen. But in saying that too, what I fear more than his attacks on me is what would happen if I didn't continue to speak the truth. I don't love being a public figure all of the time. It is difficult, and not only because of Trump, but just managing what is coming from him and his allies and supporters.
And you're
and his
27 years
enablers.
old.
Correct, but I also think when we look at America, we rely on public servants and the American people to uphold our institutions and our Constitution. And what scares me more is the fact that this could potentially be the final election of our American democracy as we know it if he's reelected.
Cassidy Hutchinson, thank you for joining me tonight.
Thank you for having me back, Caitlin.
Thank you. I am joined here tonight by William Barr, who served as the former president's attorney general and who told him that his 2020 allegations of election fraud were not true, but has now said he will support the Republican ticket, therefore Donald Trump again. Mr. Attorney General, it's great to have you. I want to talk to you about how you're going to vote in 2024 in a moment, but putting the merits aside, I like how you're laughing about that. Putting the merits aside, because I know you don't agree with the merits of the New York hush money case, but you worked for Donald Trump. You got to know him. What do you think it's like for him to be in court, being treated like any other criminal defendant, and having to be there 4 days a week?
I think it's real tough on him. I think a lot of the country sympathizes with him. So I think the longer the trial goes on, the more support he gets.
Well, I mean, he has claimed multiple times that this case is being brought essentially by President Biden. I mean, you know how this works and how the breakdown in this works. Presidents don't have any role in what a local district attorney, what case they bring.
That's normally true, and I'm not suggesting Biden is involved, but I think what they're saying is that this former federal official who's gone up to try the case, that this somehow shows a link. I don't know whether it does.
Yeah, but do you agree? I mean, you were the attorney general. Prosecutors leave and go work at other places all the time.
That's right. I think the impetus for this came from the New York prosecutors. I think that they're behind it.
And not President Biden.
I don't know.
But yeah, but you have no basis to believe that the president would be for an investigation of the drop on the Manhattan district.
Well, I don't know. I don't think it's a investigation. Politics, this is a political case.
Your predecessor was brought up at the trial, Jeff Sessions, because David Pecker, this National Enquirer tabloid king, he got concerned at one point when he got a letter from the FEC, and he called Michael Cohen, then Trump's personal attorney, to voice concern about that. Michael Cohen told him not to worry because Jeff Sessions, the attorney general, and Donald Trump has him in his pocket. Did Trump expect his AG to go easy on his friends?
I don't know what he expected.
What was your experience?
My experience was, by the time I came in, he did not push me to do one thing or another on these criminal cases. Now, he tweeted and made his public views on things, no. But he never talked to me about it directly.
So he did not have you in his pocket, you would argue.
It's not a question of argument. I did what I thought was right.
And you never felt any direct pressure from him on what investigations the DOJ was
No, he
doing?
did not directly pressure me. Yeah, as I say, he was out there tweeting and doing things that were embarrassing and made it hard for me to leave the department.
That sounds like pressure.
It wasn't pressure. It was just, for example, I had decided that we were going to not agree to a sentence on Stone that was 3 times longer than normal, and I had already decided Stone, so it just made it harder to make the decision.
Because it looked like you were acting at his
Right.
behest on Roger Stone's sentence. What they were just talking about is this gag order and the alleged violations from the prosecutors here. They say it's on 14. It's pretty clear if you read the gag order and then you look at what Trump has been saying and posting about witnesses and even commenting on the jury here. What does a judge do to deter him? Do fines work? I mean, what do you believe the judge's options are here?
Well, I personally think the gag order could be too broad here, but I think Trump's, and I've said this before, I think Trump basically has the kind of personality that he's always testing the limit. He's always going further and further. He's usually up against the line, so that's what gets him in trouble. And that's what leads to cases like we're seeing now in the Supreme Court, very fundamental cases about our Constitution, generally because of excess.
But do you think there's anything to he's testing that? I mean, how does a judge stop that? You mentioned the Supreme Court and those very important oral arguments that happened yesterday. It was really fascinating to listen to them. But at one point, his attorneys did concede that some of what Jack Smith has alleged in his indictment are private acts. And they did concede private acts can be prosecuted. In your view, does that mean that this case can move forward, at least in part?
No, I don't think the case can move forward in part. I think that if Smith thinks he can try the case entirely and establish criminal liability just on the basis of private acts, he could. But if he requires some official acts, then he has a problem. I think the problem here is that the government, Smith, sort of very, he had this broad position that there was no immunity for official acts. And that's the basis on which it was made. And both sides are arguing this sort of abstract general idea. There's no immunity, and then Trump's people make it seem like there's immunity for everything, even things that are not official acts, like just if you use the military to do something, you use the instrumentality you use to defend it.
To stage a coup.
Yeah,
Not
I mean,
just to
that's
do
ridiculous.
anything.
Yeah, it's ridiculous because the question is something he doesn't have authority to kill enemies, to kill rivals and so forth. Those are obviously acts that are not authorized or not required for him to do his job.
So why do you think they're arguing this? Because they're doubling down. It was first the SEAL Team 6 can assassinate a political rival. Yesterday it was using the military to stage a coup. They said it would depend on the circumstances whether it counted as an official act.
But I don't know why they've taken those positions. I think, the issue is whether or not the president is carrying out one of his duties, and on the other hand, the extreme position taken by the government seems to be that you can be doing an official thing like firing the FBI director or something like that, something clearly within your discretion, and yet you can be prosecuted for a crime depending on a prosecutor saying, well, you did it for an illegitimate purpose, and that would just open Pandora's box. So,
well, I didn't hear the attorney for the federal government arguing that, but what I did hear Trump's attorneys arguing, and this is something that you'll know well about, is Trump's effort to install Jeffrey Clark as the acting Attorney General of the United States. And the point for why he wanted to do that was not just picking who he thought should be running the Justice Department after you left. It was because Jeffrey Clark was going to use the power of the federal government to pressure Georgia lawmakers to overturn their legitimate results. I mean, is that an official act of the President of the United States?
well, that's going to be in that gray zone that they're going to have to sort out, and that's why I feel it's going to have to go back to the district court. Was this the president seeing that the laws were faithfully executed, or was this a candidate trying to bully and press a state into changing its vote when he knew that the vote had been against him?
Well, you were
That
there.
has to be sorted out.
You were there. Which one do you believe it is?
I'm not going to. I'd have to see all the evidence and see the case litigated.
You're one of few people. I mean, you were up there, up front and close and personal. Was he bullying people and trying to get them to carry out his will, his personal will to stay in office? Or was he carrying out, election integrity and making sure that the United States has fair elections?
But I wasn't happy with the way he behaved after the election, but whether it was a crime is a different issue. And that requires the government to articulate the basis of the crime and prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And some of these acts are gray acts. Some of these, it's difficult to say whether he was acting as a candidate or as the top law enforcement officer.
But which ones do you think are gray? Because you and I spoke right when this indictment came out, and you thought it was a pretty good indictment, a pretty solid indictment for the work of abuse.
Well, I said it was not an abuse, that it had a coherent theory. I said I didn't feel it was compelling, but it was coherent. I think the things that were private were the recruitment of the alternative slates and things like that were clearly as a candidate. But where you get into the gray zone is where he has an argument that, hey, I'm the president, I think this election is fair, I am trying to see that the laws are faithfully executed. And there has to be some precision as to where exactly he crossed the line.
So when his attorney, who was seated right here last night, was arguing that the fake slates of electors do constitute an official act, you disagree with that?
I don't think they do. I think he was doing that as a candidate. I don't see why it's part of the president's official duties to recruit alternative slates to support him as a candidate. That seems to me to be not an official act.
When you see his attorneys, kind of brazenly arguing about that a military coup could be an official act, that ordering SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival could be an official act, do those arguments undermine the integrity of the justice system in the United States?
I think they undermine the case because they were stupid examples, in my opinion. So, for example, when President Obama sent a drone strike overseas and killed an American who was apparently in a terrorist complex, that was legitimate. That was the president using his national security powers. That was within the scope of his responsibilities. But that doesn't mean a president gets to shoot drones at domestic enemies to eliminate them, and just because they're military equipment, they become an official act. The president doesn't have the power to go around killing Americans at will.
I hear from a lot of Republicans who defend Trump saying, well, that's a hypothetical and that's ridiculous. But Alyssa Farah Griffin, who was Trump's communications director, posted yesterday and said that you were present at a moment when Trump suggested executing the person who leaked information that he went to the White House bunker when those George Floyd protests were happening outside the White House. Do you remember that?
I remember him being very mad about that. I actually don't remember him saying executing, but I wouldn't dispute it. I mean, it doesn't sound. The president would lose his temper and say things like that. I doubt he would have actually carried it out. I don't.
But he would say that on other occasions. You said
The
he would lose
president,
his temper.
the president had a. I think people sometimes took him too literally, and he would say things like similar to that in occasions to blow off steam. But I wouldn't take him literally every time he did it.
Why not?
Because at the end of the day, it wouldn't be carried out, and you could talk sense.
But just because it's not carried out and you could talk sense into him, doesn't that still mean that the threat is there?
No, I mean, I think I don't think the threat is there. The thing that I worry about with President Trump is not that he's going to become an autocrat and do those kinds of things.
Why not?
Because I don't think he would.
But
At the end of the day.
what's the basis for that understanding that you have? Or is it just your own hunch?
That's my feeling, having worked for him and seen him in action. I don't think he would actually go and kill political rivals and things like that.
If the January 6th case, the election interference case, doesn't move forward before the election, is that a mistake in your view?
If it doesn't move forward? No, I mean, I've said earlier on, I would have liked to see that tried before the election, but I think it's gotten too late.
But you were talking about Jack Smith and what he charged. Isn't some part that the responsibility of the Supreme Court, that they could have heard these arguments back in December, they chose not to? They could rule sooner. They may not rule until June. I mean, they have a role in this as well.
No, I think it was teed up for them, and they acted very quickly to actually take the case quickly. And I think it hasn't been well prepared. I think the circuit court didn't do its job. It should have sent it back for a fuller record. And I think the Supreme Court is doing the best they can under those circumstances.
Last time you and I spoke, when we had you on the show, you told me that you would jump off the bridge when it came to it on who you were going to support in the 2024 election. It appears that you have jumped off that bridge because you said recently you were going to vote for the Republican ticket coming up, which means you're going to vote for Donald Trump.
I said that's what I plan to do at this stage.
You're saying you could change your mind, maybe?
Well, I'm not going to vote for Biden, this is a wild time. I expect, as between Trump and Biden, there's no question in my mind.
Oh, so you're kind of suggesting maybe Donald Trump may not be the Republican nominee?
Or Biden may not be their Democrat.
Oh, so you would vote for another Democrat if a different Democrat was on the ticket?
It's hard to imagine that this party, the Democratic Party, would nominate someone I would support.
Yeah, I know you disagree with him, but I have to ask you about something that Trump posted about you this week because he responded in response to you saying you'd vote for the Republican ticket. Wow, former AG Bill Barr, who let a lot of great people down by not investigating voter fraud in our country, has just endorsed me for president despite the fact that I called him weak, slow-moving, lethargic, gutless, and lazy. Based on the fact that I greatly appreciate his wholehearted endorsement, I am removing the word lethargic from my statement. Thank you, Bill.
Yeah. Classic Trump. What's the question?
What's your response?
Well, I mean, obviously, what I said was that I'm very disappointed that this country is stuck with this choice between two people. I don't think either of them should be president of the United States. But given that binary choice, I feel I have to choose Trump.
But he's not for you.
So it's not about me. I think that I've said this all along. If faced with a choice between two people, neither of which I think should be president, I feel it's my duty to pick the person who I think would do the least damage to the country. And I think Trump would do less damage than Biden. And I think all this stuff about a threat to democracy, I think the real threat to democracy is the progressive movement and the Biden administration.
The Biden administration or President Biden himself?
Biden's support for the progressive agenda.
I think a lot of people hear that, and the case that we just talked about that went before the Supreme Court essentially, and say, how can you see that and say that Biden is a greater threat to democracy?
Well, where are we losing our freedoms? How are our freedoms being constrained? They're being constrained by the progressive government, and democracy, especially from the Anglo-sphere democracies, the Five Eyes and so forth. The threat's never been for autocratic government on the right.
But how specifically is Biden
strongman.
threatening democracy?
The threat to freedom and democracy has always been on the left. It's the collectivist, socialist agenda, and that is where we're losing our freedom. Parents are losing the freedom to control their children's education, people can't speak their mind without losing their jobs, things like that. This is worse than the McCarthy era. Where is that coming from? It's not coming from the right.
Those two things that you just noted there, you believe are worse than a president of the United States trying to subvert the will of the people by overturning the results of the election?
I think a country, all the things together, like we're not enforcing our borders, we have open borders, we have lawlessness, regulations coming fast and furious. Stoves they can cars they have to buy, eliminating cars, and so forth. Yes, those are the threats.
But President Biden is not in control of what some school boards across the country are doing.
Using the
You can make that
administrative
argument,
what
but
are these
how is that the same?
Major changes are being made without the democratic process, and they're being made by bureaucrats and these agencies.
Okay, pause. You cannot argue that Republicans across the country are not doing that as well. In my own hometown, there's a huge fight at the library over which books kids can read. This is not something that is a single-party fight.
Do you think don't you think there should be some limits on what people are able to read at very young ages?
I just think people look at what you're saying and they don't, and maybe even Republicans who have concerns about what's happening with school boards or the culture, and don't maybe abortion even, don't equate that with January 6th and Trump's efforts. When you told him the election was not stolen, and he still went out there and said it was stolen, you led a lot of people to believe that. Those things aren't equal. It feels like a false equivalency.
Well, I disagree. I think the country is much more susceptible to losing freedoms by the excesses of the left than they have been steadily, and that's clear. People lose their jobs. Kids can't speak out in the classroom. They have to go along with what the professor says. It's become like a Stepford nation being directed by the progressive elites.
Republicans are also trying to limit what can be said in the classroom, but I do want to ask you, because you're a lifelong Republican. I don't think it's a surprise that you don't like those issues that a lot of Republicans blame on Democrats. I think there's a question of how they're the same, but I want you to listen to what another lifelong Republican, Liz Cheney, said about your decision to vote for the Republican ticket in November.
Given what Bill Barr has said publicly about Trump's lack of fitness for office, I think that his assertion now that he's actually going to support Trump for office is indefensible, and it was frankly disappointing to see.
She says it's indefensible.
That's her. The fact of the matter is, as I said all along, I agree with Trump's policies, and despite the media, the left-wing media's effort to portray it as a lawless administration, it wasn't. His policies were sound, and we had victories in courts, and we defended them. I think that Biden is unfit for office.
So you're basically saying that you are voting because you want the Republican policies.
Well, that's certainly one.
Well, I'm glad you said that.
But I also don't.
Hold on. I'm glad you said that because you told Geraldo Rivera last year You may want his policies, but Trump will not deliver Trump policies. He will deliver chaos, and if anything, lead to a backlash that will set his policies much further back than they would otherwise be. You're even acknowledging he can't accomplish those Republican policies.
What I was saying was, if you want Trump's policies, if you're mad at him and you want to make America great again, the other candidates will be successful at that much more than he will.
But
For
there's
the
not
reasons
the
I
other
stated.
candidates. It's going to be Donald Trump.
That's right. I'm certainly not going to get anywhere near what I'd like under Biden. And Biden is not a great moral exemplar. Okay? And is he following the laws? Here he is giving away another round of forgiving student loans after Wall Street. And he thinks he can get away with it by getting it out the door before the election. He's not enforcing the law.
But those are policy differences that you disagree with. Trump, I remember also when border numbers were at an all-time high in the spring of 2019. So the idea that border chaos only happens under this administration is inaccurate. But I think people
wait
see
a minute.
that.
We had it under control because we had a program approved by the Supreme Court called Remain in Mexico that was fully lawful, and it shut down the border, and he
But
came
how
in
can
and
you
lifted
equate,
it.
How can you equate, the border is a real issue. I've been with you, no one's denying that. But is that the same thing as what you said recently, which was that the conduct that was involved was trying to subvert the progress? It's probably the most important process we have is power after an election. Name one thing that Biden has done that's worse than that.
I think his whole administration.
Worse than subverting the peaceful transfer of power?
Did he succeed?
Only because Vice President Mike Pence stood in the way, and now the people who are lining
He
up to
tried
be
to
VP again say that they will not do what Mike Pence
Yeah,
did.
I mean, look, I was very loud and saying I thought it was the whole episode was shameful, and I'm very troubled by it, and that's why it's not an easy decision. But I think when you have a Hobson's choice, you have to pick the lesser of two evils.
You don't see this as the definition of putting party over country?
No. No, not because unfortunately we're in a situation where the policy differences between the two parties are very, very vast. There's a huge gulf, and so in that
But you're saying Trump can't achieve the policies.
I think he's going to have a much harder time achieving them.
But you're voting for
And
so
I
you're
also
voting.
think-
So just to be clear, you're voting for someone who you believe tried to subvert the peaceful transfer of power, that can't even achieve his own policies, that lied about the election even after his attorney general told him that the election wasn't stolen. And as the former chief law enforcement in this country, you're going to vote for someone who is facing 88 criminal counts.
Well, look, the 88 criminal counts, a lot of those are, and I've said...
Even if 10 of them are accurate.
The answer to the question is yes. I'm supporting the Republican ticket.
But can you say that you're voting for Donald Trump? Because you're not saying his name. You just say you're supporting the Republican ticket.
I've said as between Biden and Trump, I will vote for Trump because I believe he will do less damage over the 4 years. I believe we're facing the most dangerous situation we've ever faced in the world. A lot of it invited by Biden's weakness. And to have Biden out there for the next 4 years, given all the threats we face, including handing the keys to the nuclear weapon to Iran, with a vice president like Kamala Harris, endangers the country. That alone should be reason to vote for the Republican ticket. But there are a host of other reasons. Our country is unraveling in many ways. The rule of law is unraveling.
So you want to put someone back in the position with immense power who you believe disrespects the rule of law?
Well, no, I think he will enforce the law, and we'll have greater safety in our cities.
All right, this week's all-new episode of The Whole Story with Anderson Cooper, CNN correspondent Donnie O'Sullivan looks at how conspiracy theories and online misinformation are affecting this year's presidential campaign, including the rise of Christian nationalism in politics. Here's a preview.
The job of the journalist is to ask the questions, allow the person to speak, and just report the facts, what was spoken. Would you like for me to pull up the definition of journalist?
That's okay, but thank you, Julia.
Okay. I have a God-given right to speak my own truth.
But there are facts, right?
The facts have shown that the election was stolen. Whether you're willing to look at that and accept that and really Show what's going on. That's your issue, not ours. We want the God-given freedom that our Constitution and our Bill of Rights is based on.
God-given constitutional rights.
Yes.
They're two different things, right?
No, sir, they're not. Read, R-E-A-D, the Constitution. Read it out loud to yourself so that you hear what the words of the Constitution say.
God isn't mentioned in the Constitution.
Sir.
Okay, joining us right now to talk more about this, Donie O'Sullivan. Was she about to bring out the copy of her Constitution?
She was about to pull out her phone,
her
did
phone.
I. Yeah.
Okay.
As did I. We both looked up the Constitution and Bill of Rights together. There is no mention of God. It says, at one point it says in the year of our Lord, just to specify the date. But, you know, really what that gets into is this idea that, and we've spoken to a lot of Christian pastors across the country that are really worried about this, right? There's this idea among some Trump supporters, something that is being called Christian nationalism, not necessarily to say that that lady there would identify as such, but this idea that Christianity in the United States has supremacy over other religions, which of course is not the case. There's freedom of religion in this country, right? But what we're seeing is this strand within the kind of MAGA movement that Christianity should take this supreme role in the United States, and that Trump is very much the person to achieve that. So that's kind of one part of this stock that we're looking at, and we're speaking to pastors who are very concerned about this. And then when it comes to the misinformation part of it, which you heard that lady falsely say that she believes the 2020 election was stolen. You know, what we've really seen is that by convincing so many millions of Americans, I think something like a third of all Americans don't believe Biden was legitimately elected, it really opens up the floodgates to this sort of alternate reality where everything else is possible. So many other things that seem crazy seem plausible. So we also kind of dive deep into that Taylor Swift Super Bowl conspiracy theory that you might remember. We look at a bit at the genesis of that and how that became so popular.
So in your conversations with people, did you get the impression that they're really unwilling to budge if they are attaching themselves to these, you know, alternate facts? Misinformation, conspiracy theories. I mean, it just seems, you know, that nothing or no one can penetrate that.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I think a lot of what we try and do in our hour tomorrow night is to talk to people and to hear them out. You know, I don't think you're not going to change anybody's mind without talking to them in the first place, right? And you're not going to change anybody's mind in telling them that they're stupid. And so really we're trying to get at why are people buying into all of this stuff? Because a lot of the folks we meet, you know, they are very productive members of society. They have families, they have jobs, they're active in their community, but, you know, it comes to QAnon or election denialism or whatever else, they just kind of go off in this tangent. And, you know, really it's I think it's going to be the story of the 2024 election campaign and beyond. It's Americans are living in for the most part, two very different realities right now.
All right, Donie O'Sullivan, look forward to it. Thank you so much. And be sure to tune in to an all-new episode of The Whole Story with Anderson Cooper. One whole hour, one whole story, airing tomorrow at 8 p.m. Eastern and Pacific, only on CNN.
You concede that private acts don't get immunity.
We do.
Okay, and I want to know if you agree or disagree about the characterization of these acts as private. Petitioner turned to a private attorney, was willing to spread knowingly false claims of election fraud to spearhead his challenges to the election results. Private?
As alleged, I mean, we dispute the allegation, but
Of
that
course.
sounds private to me.
Sounds private. Petitioner conspired with another private attorney who caused the filing in court of a verification signed by petitioner that contained false allegations to support a challenge.
That
Private.
also sounds private.
3 private actors, 2 attorneys, including those mentioned above, and a political consultant, helped implement a plan to submit fraudulent slates of presidential electors to obstruct the certification proceeding, and petitioner and a co-conspirator attorney directed that effort.
You read it quickly. I believe that's private.
So, Steve, just to underline what you're saying here, this is Amy Coney Barrett, the justice who Trump appointed, getting Trump's attorney to concede that some of the things that he has been charged with by the special counsel Jack Smith are definitely not covered by immunity.
I think that's right, Jake. And the reason why that's so important is because you can build out from there, sending this back to the trial court. And I think the question becomes twofold. First, are there 5 justices, perhaps Justice Barrett, the 3 Democratic appointees, and Chief Justice Roberts, who can agree on what the line is that puts those acts on the prosecutable side and maybe some other things not? And then, Jake, second, timing. If that agreement exists, if there is at least 5 votes for that proposition, how quickly can the justices write that opinion, especially if there are separate opinions, concurrences, or dissents from the other 4 Republican appointees, from Justices Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh. And so I think, where's John Roberts, and how quickly can he draw a line that at least Justice Barrett and the 3 Democratic appointees are comfortable with sending back to the lower court? That's the real takeaway I have after that 2-hour and almost 50-minute argument.
Ellie, do you agree?
I do, Jake. It looks to me like we could be headed for a Richard Nixon-like resolution here, and here's what I mean.
You mean that quickly?
Not that quickly, but in
Okay.
terms of the way it comes out. Richard Nixon resolution was within 2 weeks or so. It's going to take longer. 1974, Richard Nixon gets a subpoena. He says, but I have executive privilege. That was never recognized by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court comes back a couple weeks later with good news, bad news. Good news is, you're right, there is such thing as executive privilege. Bad news, it does not apply to you in this situation, Richard Nixon. And it could well be that this court says, for the first time in history, yes, there is such thing as immunity, criminal immunity for the president. However, it does not ultimately apply to you, Donald Trump, on the facts. The question is, how much do they have to go through together? How much time is it going to take? And I think it does a remand back to the district court, which will take plenty of time.
All right, let me throw it to Kayla Collins right outside the court.
Yeah, it's very fascinating to listen to those conversations and Trump's attorney making those arguments. I've got my panel back here with me, Paula Reed and Casey Hine. And Paula, there was a moment that we were all listening to that caught everyone's ear where it was Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson essentially asking the reverse of what Trump's attorney was arguing, which was, he's saying if this is what Jack Smith and the government says it is, then future presidents are going to be chill. They're not going to be able to make decisions as bold and fearlessly as we've seen presidents do for the last few years. And she kind of reversed that question. And I want to listen to that first. It was a few hours ago of what Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson had to ask Trump's attorneys.
If someone with those kinds of powers, the most powerful person in the world, with the greatest amount of authority, could go into office knowing that there would be no potential penalty for committing crimes, I'm trying to understand what the disincentive is from turning the Oval Office into, the seat of criminal activity in this country. If potential for criminal liability is taken off the table, wouldn't there be a significant risk that future presidents would be emboldened to commit crimes with abandon while they're in office?
I mean, that is really reversing their argument, basically putting it on its head.
Yeah, exactly. And it acknowledges that the task before the justices right now is to set the standard for criminal liability for all presidents in the future. It's pretty clear from what we've heard, the majority of justices are not willing to just toss out the special counsel's case. And as you heard there from her, she's like, you could potentially make the Oval Office a hotbed of heard them kind of draw down their argument because Justice Amy Coney Barrett, she got one of Trump's lawyers to concede that not everything in this indictment was an official act. That was so significant. And so that's kind of the bad news for Trump, right? But the good news is that Chief Justice John Roberts clearly believes that the lower courts did not do enough to suss out exactly what is an official act versus a private act. So what they're setting up here is likely the justices are going to come up with some sort of test and then send it back down to the lower courts for more litigation. And what that means is that we could maybe all be sitting here again in a year after more litigation at the lower court level, or if Trump is reelected, he can make this case go away. So even if he's not likely poised for a legal win at the high court, strategically, it sounded like this is going to be a win for him.
The second act in Donald Trump's legal double feature today occurred about 200 miles south of I-95 from New York. While some of his legal team spent the entire day in the courtroom in Lower Manhattan, other lawyers were arguing before justices at the Supreme Court on Trump's claim of what he calls absolute immunity. Now, they were signaling today that they could very well send this case back to a lower court, which of course would delay the special counsel's 2020 election subversion case that was supposed to start back in March. It's almost May. But he also sounded skeptical about Trump's blanket immunity defense. Trump lawyer John Sauer argued that Trump's actions were official acts of the office, but in one exchange, the Trump-appointed Justice Amy Coney Barrett questioned what exactly was an official act and what was a private act to benefit Trump.
Petitioner turned to a private attorney, was willing to spread knowingly false claims of election fraud to spearhead his challenges to the election results. Private?
As alleged. I mean, we dispute the allegation, but
Of
that
course.
sounds private to me.
Sounds private. Petitioner conspired with another private attorney who caused the filing in court of a verification signed by petitioner that contained false allegations to support a challenge.
That
Private.
also sounds private.
3 private actors, 2 attorneys, including those mentioned above, and a political consultant helped implement a plan to submit fraudulent slates of presidential electors to obstruct the certification proceeding, and petitioner and a co-conspirator attorney directed that effort.
You read it quickly. I believe that's private.
With me now is Jack Rakove, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, historian, and professor at Stanford. He'd also signed onto an amicus brief to the Supreme Court rejecting Trump's immunity claims. Thank you for joining us this evening. It sounds like this immunity question may not be close to being resolved completely and could actually go back to the lower courts. What is your opinion of if that were to happen and you don't get the answer resolved fully by this Supreme Court?
Oh, I suppose my basic answers would be a political disaster for the country as a whole. And I think the basic reason for that is that speaking in a sense on behalf of the founders, which is what the historians group of whom I'm a part have been studying, I think the framers of the Constitution, the founders more generally, would have expected a matter of this urgency to be resolved in advance of an election and not to be kind of slow-walked at the quirky pace we've been moving at, so that people would not be able to have an informed judgment about the qualifications of leading candidates.
I mean, as you describe it, it makes sense to think that the idea of whenever you have a president, you want some urgent clarification as to what the bounds of their power actually is. Elections are important, but also there is a president right now. I wonder what you made of the hypotheticals that were proposed about the future. There was not a lot of time spent on January 6th or election subversion case, but more, as I think it was Gorsuch who says, deciding a case for the ages. What did you make of the focus from this court on this issue?
Well, the issue is so anomalous, just as Trump's behavior is so anomalous, that the idea that you can take the, on the one hand, quirky, but also really deeply troubling circumstances that surround January 6th, and say that on the basis of that one situation, you can decide a case for the ages, will strike most legal commentators, certainly most historians, as being a deeply problematic statement. I think Justice Barrett, in her exchange with Sauer, the petitioner's attorney, I think she nailed the key points. That there were a number of very specific matters that one should focus on. And Justice Alito, when he intervened in his own way, kept trying to deny the importance of the immediate issues to kind of speculate about what might happen in the future. We have an urgent issue right now. That issue needs to be resolved. We can worry about the future when the future comes. We have to get through the current crisis to the public. This is why the court should be acting expeditiously.
Well said. I mean, listen to this exchange as well between Justice Elena Kagan and Sauer about this hypothetical question of prosecuting a former president who, for example, staged a coup.
I don't feel like leaving office. I want to stage a coup. Is that immune?
If it's an official act, there needs to be impeachment and conviction beforehand because the framers viewed that kind of
If
very
it's an
low
official
risk.
act, is it an official act?
If it's an official act, it's impeachment.
Is it an official act?
On the way you've described that hypothetical, it could well be.
Now, of course, in your amicus brief with other historians, you forcefully argue against this assertion that a president can only be prosecuted
only after being impeached and convicted. So what do you make of his answer that he gave today? And I would note he also doubled down earlier on this assertion that a president could order, say, SEAL Team 6 under an official action to even hurt a political rival.
Yeah, well, from a historian's perspective, we don't deal in hypotheticals. We do with things that actually happened and views that people actually adopted. I think the most important thing we say is that in the 17th and 18th century, both England and America, the dominant theme in constitutional thinking was how do you cabin, how do you control, how do you restrain, how do you constitutionalize executive power? Sauer, the attorney made a big point of appealing to the vesting clause of Article 2, which says the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States. That clause has been carrying a lot of interpretive weight recently, probably more than it really deserves because it's adopted very late and without much discussion. But if you ask the question, what is the nature of the executive power that is vested in the president? I think the historian's first definition would be that he shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And I think the best commentary on this actually came from John Dickinson at the Federal Convention, where he says that the real virtue of vesting the executive power in a single person, it's not the question of acting with energy and with dispatch. Those were two terms that the framers used. It's also the question of responsibility. So the idea of recognizing this open-ended, unconstrained, in certain ways unimaginable degree of immunity, there's no way you can square that with the dominant value of Anglo-American thinking from the late 17th century down into the time of the Revolution and the Constitution, which tries to make executive power responsible, and indeed which concentrates the executive power in a single person to enhance that end. So the whole immunity argument would strike all the historians, my friends and colleagues who were co-signers in brief. It just strikes us as being, in a certain sense, historically nuts.
And that's why we need historians. Thank you so much, Jack Raycove. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I want to bring back in our panel.
Historically nuts. I like
Historically, I mean,
that's a good one.
That might be a new brand. Those people called planters. Marcus, you were actually in the Supreme Court, and I'm just wondering what that was like in those moments. We were all listening to it and getting a sense from the outside. But what was the atmosphere like in there? Was it tense? Was it relaxed? Tell me about it.
So I remember the very first primetime hearing from a couple summers ago. It was probably the heaviest feeling I'd felt before a hearing. We wanted to get it right as a committee, and you just felt like a stress before it started. I felt the similar way.
Well, history was in waiting for you to act. That's probably what it is, huh?
It really was, and our work was going to be judged for history, right? Mm-hmm. And I felt like the Supreme Court, you could tell the justices could tell that what they were going to decide in the next month or two would be remembered historically. I mean, that's kind of how they started out. Trump's counsel saying that no president, as we know it, will be the same moving forward if they don't have absolute immunity, right? And so it just felt like it was a very historical moment. There were a few moments where jokes were made, like Justice Alito saying you can get a ham sandwich indicted, that made us laugh a little bit to bring it back, but it was a very tense 2 hours and 45 minutes in that courtroom today.
I mean, go ahead.
I do not understand why the Supreme Court decided to take this case. I still don't, and especially now after today, because it seems pretty clear that the court has leeway to decide what they take, what they decide to settle, and what they don't. There are a lot of legal issues out in the world that are not settled. Not all of them need to be settled right now. This one does not strike me as something that needs to be settled right now. Why are they doing this?
Because Donald Trump is a candidate for president, and several of the justices were appointed by him. But I just want to...
Do you think also that they might be worried about establishing those boundaries of where the presidential power is in the event of a Donald Trump presidency in which he might, test some of these things?
I agree, and I predict this. Justice Roberts, I believe, will be thinking about Dred Scott, Plessy versus Ferguson, the Nixon tapes case, and he will know that where he stands, majority-minority, will haunt him for the rest of his life. And he wants to establish himself in history. They read the papers. So I predict, I'm being a Pollyanna. I think Justice Roberts is going to do the right thing. And you could possibly see a 5-4 opinion rejecting absolute immunity, and it's Justice Roberts and the 4 women. I predict that could be it. I did want to add one last thing. Nobody's mentioned this. There should have been 8 justices hearing that case today. Justice Thomas, I teach legal ethics, Professor Kim does. There is no ethics lecture at law schools or any level that would say there's not an actual conflict or at a minimum an apparent conflict. He should not be hearing this case, period. End of story.
Well, you know, it's funny, we're talking about no more kings, the professor, this idea that historically the whole point of the revolution was no more kings, and we've created 9 kings. We have a Supreme Court that essentially has no accountability, and that's why we're in a position where someone with these egregious conflicts of interest that really give him an incentive to favor Donald Trump because his wife was involved, et cetera. There's all these public conflicts where there's justices being, you know, jetted around by billionaires with interest before the court, but there's no enforcement mechanism for ensuring that these people are nonpartisan, other than life tenure, which ironically makes them even more, I think, above the law in this moment.
And we have breaking news. Arizona's Attorney General has just announced multiple charges in connection to the 2020 fake elector scheme to try to help Donald Trump overturn the election in the crucial state of Arizona, which was, of course, won by just over 10,000 votes. Among those charged, the 11 alleged fake electors for Trump. And here's the full indictment. There's others that we know here as they are serving these individuals. Some of these names are redacted, but we can figure out who some of them are. Several others also indicted. They are, as I said, some of these names are going to be redacted until they have been served. But we can tell you, because we are learning, that Rudy Giuliani, Mark Meadows are among them, as well as other people names in the inner circle of Trump. So let's go straight to Zachary Cohn outside the Maricopa County Superior Courthouse, breaking this. So Zach, just going through this, look, I'm just going through the number of pages here, 58 pages. You've been able to go through this here literally as this is breaking. What else can you tell us about who is being charged and with what?
Yeah, Aaron, like you said, look, the 11 fake electors from Arizona, the Trump fake electors, they were all indicted. That includes Kelly Ward, who was the former head of the Republican Party here in Arizona, along with her husband, Michael Ward. But more importantly, these names that are redacted, we're learning more about who those people are. They include, as you mentioned, Rudy Giuliani, the former personal attorney of Donald Trump. It includes former Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, and it includes Boris Epshteyn, who is still a very close advisor to Donald Trump. And in fact, sources have told us, and people close to Trump have told us, that the reason Boris Epshteyn hasn't been seen with Trump in New York for the start of his criminal trial there is because of concerns of this looming indictment, so that coming to fruition today.
And so some of these defendants and some of these that you're naming, Boris, obviously, Rudy Giuliani, Mark Meadows, their names are redacted in the version that we have now because I understand they're still actually in the process of serving them. So when I say this is breaking, it's breaking to that level. Is there anything else you can tell us about some of these redacted names, which, by the way, are written, some of them in the context of unindicted co-conspirator number 1 was unwilling to accept that he lost the election, right? That unindicted co-conspirator number 1 obviously then is Donald J. Trump.
Right, absolutely. And look, these are all individuals from the Trump world, from the Trump universe. The 3 we've identified so far are obviously very close to Trump, or were very close to Trump at a certain time, especially when he was trying to overturn the 2020 election. And we'll learn more about these other redacted names probably in the next few minutes here, but we are told that they're all from that inner circle, from those people that were working in Trump's orbit to help him overturn the 2020 election. And look, this investigation here in Arizona, it's obviously coming years after those efforts were first exposed. But we always thought that it was really focused on the fake electors themselves. Myself and Marshall Cohen have reported, though, in the last few months that the probe did seem to be expanding and did seem to be looking into people who were connected to the Trump campaign on a national level. And now we know that some of these names in this indictment are in that inner circle of Trump's orbit. So we'll bring you more when we have it. But for now, we do know that some of these really close advisors to Donald Trump are included in this indictment.
Zach, thank you very much. All right, so as you get more and you go through this, please, we're going to bring you back into this conversation because, as I said, this is a 58-page document. We're having a chance here to go through it as we speak. So Zach will continue with that. Ryan Goodman, Joey Jackson are back with me, and we're also now joined by former Trump White House lawyer Ty Cobb here with us in New York. All right, so I know we're all just getting a chance to look through this here. Ryan, I'm just going through quickly. 9 felony counts. But can we just hone in here on this? Obviously, the fake electors in the state of Arizona charged. Can we just hone in on this inner circle of Trump? Page 20, I'm just going to hold it up for everyone to see. All these black marks are redacted names, but some of these names include Mark Meadows, Rudy Giuliani, Boris Epstein, and what else can you tell?
So I think what's incredible here is that Donald Trump is unindicted co-conspirator number one, unindicted. Yet his two alter egos, Mark Meadows, who is his chief of staff, and Rudy Giuliani, his personal attorney, are indicted. So how is it explicable that Donald Trump is not indicted? I think that's the key question. Just to take a page from the federal indictment, which identifies Rudy Giuliani running with Donald Trump in Arizona to overturn the popular vote. The federal indictment says Giuliani and Trump, quote, made knowingly false claims of election fraud aimed at interfering with the ascertainment and voting by Arizona's electors, end quote, when they're on the call with Rusty Bowers, the Republican head of the Arizona legislature. Rudy Giuliani as a co-conspirator of Donald Trump. But here in the Arizona indictment, Donald Trump is left out. That's a huge question.
Ty, what do you make of that? I mean, it is very clear here, page 21, unindicted co-conspirator number one.
Right.
Can I just read the description here? A former president of the United States who spread false claims of election fraud following the 2020 election. There's a Jeopardy question.
Right.
Sorry.
Who is?
Who is unindicted co-conspirator number one? What do you make of that?
So I think the distinction may be, having not had sufficient time to be certain of this, but I think the distinction may be people who actually acted in Arizona. I think as I review it, it appears that Giuliani was active in organizing the fake electors, worked with Kelly Ward. I think the same thing is true of the other people who were indicted in conversations, Meadows and Giuliani and Trump. So Eastman is unindicted co-conspirator number 4. As that seems.
Yeah, there are 5 unindicted co-conspirators. So you're saying 4 you think is clearly Eastman.
I think 4 is clearly Eastman. And but those are people who didn't, conduct the elector scheme on the ground or organize it in a way actively in Arizona. They were people who were above that fray. Giuliani was there actually taking action. Same thing with Meadows in terms of coordination. So I think that's the distinction.
All right. So, Joey, I'm just going through this 9 felony counts, as I said. And this is just to give the summary. Conspiracy, fraudulent schemes, forgery,
problematic. Let me be prosecuted before I'm defense, right?
Yep.
Now, the issue from the prosecution's perspective, and people at home are saying, look, whether you acted on the ground or not, if you were a mastermind of an enterprise, it doesn't matter where you are. The issue is, to what extent were you involved? To what extent did you aid, abet, or do any activity that might further the interests of forgery, et cetera, as you say.
Yep.
And so I think people are wondering, well, why isn't everyone accountable? Prosecutors have a great deal of discretion, right? And so prosecutors are going to do what they feel is in the best interest to secure the indictment they secure, but it's a fair question as to why these unindicted people are not actually indicted. Now, from a defense perspective, Aaron, and you have to get into the realm of politics, even in law, because it's become so political. You know what Trump's going to say. Who is the Attorney General? Democrat or Republican? Democrat. Why did it take so long to do this? She's going to say, because I came after a person who was in office for 2 terms who did nothing. But you can look to this to be attacked on political grounds as the basis for which it's moving forward. I guarantee you that's what all the news reports are going to be. It was because of this Democratic Attorney General. It lacks evidence, it lacks information, et cetera. The proof will be in the specific details of an indictment.
And I know we're literally trying to, as we're sort of skim through this, but what I'm noticing already, Ryan, just going through it here, that there are a lot of text messages and other corroborating data, just even going through this in terms of some of the allegations. Yes, what one would call proof.
Absolutely, and some of it actually spilled out into the New York Times earlier, so they actually had a lot of the written communications in which some of the Arizona players referred to the alternative electors as fake electors, and then they said to each other, maybe that's not the best term that we should use for it. They were also going to try to hide the information about the false electors until January 6th and then spring it on Congress, which is not the way you go about submitting your elector slate to Congress if it was a legitimate operation. So that internal documentation is damning when now we're getting into a prosecution setting. And I think that's going to be very important. It actually does set aside Arizona as different than other states because I think the evidence is just much stronger here for the prosecutors.
I mean, it is very, very laid out. So, Ty, when you go through 9 felony counts,
Yes.
being the allegations, can you just lay out the significance of that? What does that mean in terms of what these people who are being charged, what would the repercussions of conviction be?
So the repercussions of conviction, I think, are very serious. I think that it's highly likely that jail time is on the table for some of these people. I think particularly those who were at the head of the table in terms of organizing this and getting the scheme off. Could be subjected to jail time. I do think that the 9 counts actually, as a former prosecutor, I view that as good prosecuting. I mean, I think, you see these 34-count indictments like we have in,
You're saying you see 9 as narrow?
Yeah, I see 9 as, focused. I mean, keep in mind, this is a 14-month investigation. And the Arizona Attorney General, who is going to get criticized for this, of course, but she's a serious lawyer. This, as far as I can tell, having gone through this, looks pretty well organized. And, the proof will be in the actual trial. But, the way the indictment is laid out, it's carefully crafted and seems to be a very serious document.
And Aaron, just in terms of Ty's point, which is a very good one, of course, as it relates to what prosecutors do, they charge these multiple indictments, right? And the issue with that is anyone will do. If you get one conviction as it relates to a multiple indicted case, you're a winner. And the offense, it really depends upon what you've been convicted of. But some of these sentences, right, are quite significant. And so when you have a multi-count indictment, it really enhances the exposure of the individuals who are indicted.
News now, we have the full transcript from the trial today, and even though virtually nothing happens in court without a team of reporters posting it online almost in real time, even the fastest reporter can't capture the scope and the sweep and the full context that the complete record does. CNN's John Berman's been going through it, including more of David Pecker's testimony in the catch and kill scheme at the heart of the case. Some of it deals with former Playboy model Karen McDougal, whose story of her alleged relationship with Trump was caught and killed by David Pecker. Before we bring you details of the transcript, I just want to play for you what Karen McDougal told me in her only television interview about why she decided to tell her story.
I feel like the contract is illegal. I feel like I wasn't presented correctly. I was lied to, and everybody involved in this deal. I want the rights back, and I want to share my truth because everyone else is talking about my truth, which I need to share my story.
Do you have any regrets about the relationship that you said you had with him?
Back then?
Yeah.
The only regret I have about the relationship that I had with Donald was the fact that he was married.
And John Berman joined me now. So, John, you've been digging deeper into the transcript. What stands out?
First of all, this is the transcript of just today, so you can see how much paper comes out here. And the part where they talk about Karen McDougal was at the very end of today's hearing. The prosecution saved the Karen McDougal part. And in here, David Pecker recounts being pulled out of a meeting from a phone call by Donald Trump to ask about the various whispers that have been going on about Karen McDougal. We don't have graphics of this, but let me read this to you. Pecker says in the testimony, he mentioned to me, he said, I spoke to Michael Cohen. He said, he told me about that time. He told me about that. He said, he told me about Karen. He said to me, what do you think? This is Pecker saying that Trump asked him, what do you think about Karen McDougal? Pecker goes on to say, I believe you should buy it. I believe you, Trump, should buy the Karen McDougal story. Trump said to me, look, everything he says, I don't buy stories. And he said that anytime you do anything like this, it always gets out. Pecker says, I still believe we should take the story off the market. Trump says, let me think about it, and I'll have Michael Cohen call you in a few days. And this we do have a graphic of. Later in the testimony, Pecker talks about how he was speaking to Michael Cohen. This is Josh Steinglass, the prosecutor. How would you describe Michael Cohen's tone during those calls about Karen McDougal? Pecker says, Michael was very agitated. It looked like he was getting a lot of pressure to get the answer, like right away. Steinglass asks, what makes you say that? Pecker says, he kept on calling, and each time he called, he seemed more anxious. Steinglass says, did you understand as to where that pressure to find out more was coming from? Pecker says, well, I assumed he had a conversation with Mr. Trump, and Mr. Trump was asking Michael Cohen, Did we hear anything yet?
You would have
Objection. You can't assume.
Right.
As soon as you hear the word assume, objection. Look, he was jumping up before I was. I mean, a witness can't testify. I assume this or I assume that. Those aren't facts or objection, right? I apologize for just screaming out. It's just my instinct. Look, I do find the transcript fascinating, and I'm dying to read it. And actually, a friend of mine, Jim Walden, who's a brilliant attorney, he's the one who filed the motion asking for the daily transcript to be released. The people who aren't too happy about it are the court reporters who get paid to daily copy to do this. But, again, these aren't crimes. Like, nothing that you just spoke about is a crime. Michael Cohen being anxious is not a crime. It just means it's something that they're interested in. And Abby, when you talk about their relationship changing in 2015, we now know that when you declare yourself for public office, whether it's city council person or president of the United States, they come out. They're coming to get you, which is now why we don't get good people running for office anymore, because they go back to high school and see what you did back then. So I'm not surprised that once Trump goes from being a TV star and a real estate magnate to being president of the United States, all of these people come out. And yeah, it's a mutually beneficial society, and they're there to help each other.
To me, the anxiety of Michael Cohen spoke to the pressure
from Trump.
Assumed from Trump. So, I mean, that's the only reason that matters. But the other thing I would just note, I mean, the Karen McDougal story is not over. This is just the beginning of what we will learn about this Karen McDougal story. And when you look at the charging documents here for Trump, there are some hints about where this goes next. David Pecker ends up paying her, but at some point, he decides to not get reimbursed from Trump World. And I'm curious as to why that happened. So this is the opening salvo, but there's more to come.
Yeah, so again, you're not going to find the crime A to Z found in any one paragraph of testimony. Prosecutors have to build a case here. And I think two things jump out at me from that transcript. One, this is a full 9-alarm fire in Trump World and in the National Enquirer, in Pecker's environment. They're pulling each other out of meetings. They're borderline panicking. The other thing is it establishes a really important chain of communication, because this is one of the rare instances, there's a few, where David Pecker has direct contact with Donald Trump. Most of it's with Michael Cohen. And the weakness that Arthur just pointed out is, well, how do you know that Michael Cohen was truly acting on Donald Trump's behalf? You can't assume, you're right. And maybe Michael Cohen was just a free agent. I mean, Michael Cohen's not super reliable. But the chain here is David Pecker makes contact with Donald Trump, who essentially hands him off to Michael Cohen, says, Cohen's going to handle this, you two go and do your thing.
I'll have Michael Cohen call you back in a few days.
Exactly.
One of the things, though, that David Pecker said today, and correct me if I'm wrong on the stand, was that, according to him, Trump was very detail-oriented and actually paid attention to a lot of the mundane details of this transaction. He's not saying that he was aware that the line item was a legal fee, but he's indicating Trump was very much involved in this. And what you just read, John, also backs that up, that according to Cohen, and what Cohen will probably testify, is that Donald Trump is breathing down his neck very closely following the Karen McDougal situation.
He talked about how he would sit with Trump in Trump Tower on the 26th floor, and Trump's assistant at the time would come in and bring him invoices and checks, which I thought was a really notable moment.
I have that. I can read that.
And Donald Trump would sign it.
I can read that. This is from page 1002 of the transcript, signing checks. Joshua Steinglass, the prosecutor, asks, did you have occasion over the years to observe Mr. Trump's business practices? Pecker responds, yes. Josh Steinglass asks, in what context? Pecker responds, I had a meeting with Mr. Trump in his office, and when I was there, his assistant, Rona, brought in a batch of invoices and checks to sign, and I observed Mr. Trump, and I noticed that he reviewed the invoice and looked at the check, and then he was signing them.
That tells you a couple of things. First of all, it's very important that the prosecution established that Donald Trump knew what the corporate records were. That's what this whole case is about. The other thing that tells you is that David Pecker is not on Team Trump. He didn't have to give that kind of testimony. He was burying Donald Trump with that. You know,
why, Jeffrey? Why? I agree with you, but why?
I'll tell you
why is he not
I'll tell you one good reason. Because
when the shark moves on, the remora fish is all alone.
well, okay, I agree with, but he could also be. They could have figured out a way to charge him.
But wait a second. You know,
Okay, but I feel
David
like we're putting
Pecker.
the horse before the cart. I mean, this is witness number one. He hasn't even been cross-examined yet. There is still a lot of road left to go here. And I think what they're establishing, though, is that Trump paid very close attention to what we all know, his finances. He doesn't part easily with his money. I was looking, Karen McDougal wrote a lot down about her relationship with Trump when they were having this alleged affair, which Trump denies. But she wrote down that Trump was so careful with his money and he was so worried about creating a paper trail of their relationship that she would book her travel when they would meet places and Trump would reimburse her.
I mean, let's just step back for a second. If a married guy is having an affair and having sex allegedly with a porn star and it's starting to unravel, he's going to pay very close attention, I would imagine, to every detail of how this is being hushed up. I mean, is this not just, this is not something you would, I don't care if he's the top executive of whatever, you would think this is actually something I would actually want to know all the details of.
And that's
like,
why.
is this, he wanted to know, he says at one point to Michael Cohen, this has to be paid in cash, doesn't he? I mean, at one point he's talking about this needing to be done in cash.
That's on a tape that that we're going to hear soon in this trial. Michael Cohen secretly recorded Donald Trump. A shady move, by the way. I had 4 defense lawyers in the green room with me today. I said, have you ever even thought about
I'm just saying,
doing this?
if you've done
Absolutely not.
something that threatens your marriage, are you going to leave it up to Michael Cohen to handle
tape,
every detail without checking, like being an overlord on
That's
him?
what a common sense, rational person would do. But the tape that we're talking about here that Michael Cohen makes of Donald Trump actually suggests Donald Trump is like, just get it done. He's not in the weeds. In fact, at one point, Michael Cohen says, no. I got it. Alan and I are going to handle. You don't worry about it. We're going to pay him. You don't worry about the how. And the how is the crime. So when that tape comes up, that's going to be a problem for the prosecutors.
Well, I also think that, part of the thing about Trump paying attention to details is more to what Caitlin was saying, which is the amount of money, even for a very rich person like Donald Trump, he didn't really want to part ways with $150,000 for Karen McDougal, $130,000 for Stormy. He did not want to part ways with that money.
He still
tried
hesitates to pay his attorneys.
He tried to get out of it once the election was over. So it's really about the dollars here that was concerning to him.
We have the full transcript from the trial today, and even though virtually nothing happens in court without a team of reporters posting it online almost in real time, even the fastest reporter can't capture the scope and the sweep and the full context that the complete record does. CNN's John Berman's been going through it, including more of David Pecker's testimony in the catch and kill scheme at the heart of the case. Some of it deals with former Playboy model Karen McDougal, whose story of her alleged relationship with Trump was caught and killed by David Pecker. Before we bring you details of the transcript, I just want to play for you what Karen McDougal told me in her only television interview about why she decided to tell her story.
I feel like the contract is illegal. I feel like I wasn't presented correctly. I was lied to, and everybody involved in this deal. I want the rights back, and I want to share my truth because everyone else is talking about my truth, which I need to share my story.
Do you have any regrets about the relationship that you say you had with him?
Back then?
Yeah.
The only regret I have about the relationship that I had with Donald was the fact that he was married.
And John Berman joined me now. So, John, you've been digging deeper into the transcript. What stands out?
First of all, this is the transcript of just today, so you can see how much paper comes out here. And the part where they talk about Karen McDougal was at the very end of today's hearing. The prosecution saved the Karen McDougal part. And in here, David Pecker recounts being pulled out of a meeting from a phone call by Donald Trump to ask about the various whispers that have been going on about Karen McDougal. We don't have graphics of this, but let me read this to you. Pecker says in the testimony, he mentioned to me, he said, I spoke to Michael Cohen. He said, he told me about that time. He told me about that. He said, he told me about Karen. He said to me, what do you think? This is Pecker saying that Trump asked him, what do you think about Karen McDougal? Pecker goes on to say, I believe you should buy it. I believe you, Trump, should buy the Karen McDougal story. Trump said to me, look, everything he says, I don't buy stories. And he said that anytime you do anything like this, it always gets out. Pecker says, I still believe we should take the story off the market. Trump says, let me think about it, and I'll have Michael Cohen call you in a few days. And this we do have a graphic of. Later in the testimony, Pecker talks about how he was speaking to Michael Cohen. This is Josh Steinglass, the prosecutor. How would you describe Michael Cohen's tone during those calls about Karen McDougal? Pecker says, Michael was very agitated. It looked like he was getting a lot of pressure to get the answer, like right away. Steinglass asks, what makes you say that? Pecker says he kept on calling, and each time he called, he seemed more anxious. Steinglass says, did you understand? Did you understand as to where that pressure to find out more was coming from? Pecker says, well, you know, I assumed he had a conversation with Mr. Trump, and Mr. Trump was asking Michael Cohen, did we hear anything yet?
You would have
Objection. You can't assume. As soon as you hear the word assume, objection. Look, he was jumping up before I was. I mean, a witness can't testify. I assume this or I assume that. That's not. Those aren't facts or objection, right? I apologize for just screaming out. It's just my instinct. Look, I do find the transcript fascinating, and I'm dying to read it. And actually, a friend of mine, Jim Walden, who's a brilliant attorney, he's the one who filed the motion asking for the daily transcript to be released. The people who aren't too happy about it are the court reporters who get paid daily copy to do this. But, you know, again, these aren't crimes. Like, nothing that you just spoke about is a crime. Michael Cohen being anxious is not a crime. It just means it's something that they're interested in. And Abby, when you talk about their relationship changing in 2015, we now know that when you declare yourself for public office, whether it's city council person or president of the United States, they come out. They're coming to get you, which is now why we don't get good people running for office anymore, because they go back to high school and see what
throw up our hands or alternatively put our heads in the sand, and it will still come at us.
Major funding for PBS News Weekend has been provided by
Certified Financial Planner professionals are proud to support PBS News Weekend. CFP professionals are committed to acting in their clients' best interest. More information at letsmakeaplan.org.
and with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. And friends of the NewsHour. This program was made possible by the corporation.
Joining me now to follow it up, we have Christy Greenberg, former federal prosecutor and former deputy chief of the criminal division at SDNY, now an MSNBC legal analyst, and Suzanne Craig, New York Times investigative reporter, both of whom were in court this week. Welcome to you both. Christy, Trump's lawyers tried Friday to poke some holes into Pecker's testimony. What do you think jurors took away from this week?
Charged here with falsifying business records in order to conceal an agreement with others to unlawfully influence the election. And so what you heard from David Pecker was about that agreement that Donald Trump, David Pecker, and Michael Cohen had to unlawfully influence the election. And they testified about this August 2015 meeting, where they anticipated that women may come forward and have damaging stories about Trump that could hurt the campaign. David Pecker testified that he was going to be the eyes and ears of the campaign, and that he was going to alert Michael Cohen and the campaign about anything that would be damaging so that they could make sure those stories didn't see the light of day. And what was really significant were the conversations Pecker testified to directly with Donald Trump, both before the election and after the election. Before the election, he testified about talking to him about the story, trying to kill the story with Karen McDougal. And then after the election, he testified about conversations where Donald Trump thanked him for making sure those damaging stories did not see the light of day. The defense tried to act as though this was all business as usual, but that really backfired because it wasn't business as usual. The magazine is going to make money from publishing stories, not from killing stories. And so that really fell flat, and I felt like Tucker was a very good witness for the state.
Suzanne, Trump's former assistant, Rona Graff, she didn't say much, but she did share a fascinating detail about the differences in how contact information for Karen McDougal and Stormy Daniels were listed. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So Rona Graff is an interesting person in Trump's world. She was his assistant for decades, and she wasn't on the stand for very long yesterday, but she did testify to some interesting things. And there was two names that she testified that she entered into his contact database. One was Karen McDougal's, and you had her first and her last name, her email. I think there was a phone number there. It was put up actually on a screen for the court to see. And then the other information was Stephanie Clifford, but it didn't say Stephanie Clifford. All it had was Stormy and then a cell phone number. And it was interesting because I think part of the reason that Rona Graff was brought in to testify was to establish potentially for the defense that the relationship between Donald Trump and Stormy Daniels could have been about Stormy Daniels wanting to become a contestant on the Celebrity Apprentice, that she wanted something from him. Because she came to Trump Tower in 2007. She's written about it in her book called Full Disclosure. They had a meeting, and the allegation that was left by the defense for the jury was that she was there angling to get a slot. It wouldn't be a job, but a slot, a celebrity spot on that show, Celebrity Apprentice.
Interesting. So, Christy, you have Todd Blanche, who explained somewhat awkwardly to the jury why he still calls Trump president. But prosecutors have been objecting to his use of that title. Why is that?
Well, it's confusing at times because he's referring to him as President Trump during time periods when he was not president. A lot of the lead up that we've been hearing about in David Pecker's testimony was before the election. So it is confusing to refer to Donald Trump as the president during a time when he wasn't. So it's just confusing for the jurors. But ultimately, I think that the defense is doing this really for two reasons. First is to placate Donald Trump. His lawyers in the civil fraud trial also referred to him as President Trump, even though there was no jury there. And they did the same thing in their court filings. So I think the second point is to try to really drive home the point to the jury that he is not just any criminal defendant. He is the former president, and so he is somebody who is different and should be treated differently by them, and they should consider that when they deliberate. So I think it's for those two reasons: to placate him, as well as to drive that point home to the jury.
And Suzanne, David Pecker talked about when he visited Trump Tower on January 6, 2017, and James Comey and others were there. And he said that Trump introduced him as the owner and publisher of the National Enquirer, and then added, Pecker probably knows more than anybody else in the room. It was a joke, apparently. Pecker said, unfortunately, they didn't laugh. But Trump got a chuckle out of that?
He did. It was quite a moment when that testimony was given in court, just to imagine that the head of the FBI and those other senior people were there, and that the head of the National Enquirer is brought into Trump Tower, and he was brought up. Jared Kushner actually brought him up to the office. He was going to talk to Donald Trump, and after that introduction, there was a side conversation, we believe out of earshot of those people, including James Comey, where Donald Trump again asks David Pecker about our girl and how is she doing, and they have another conversation about that, the relationship that Donald Trump had with Karen McDougal, and is she talking, and it's still just at the front of his mind, even at that period of time, that this information could come out.
Excuse me, Christy. Pecker asked Trump one question on different occasions at Trump Tower, again at the White House. How is Karen doing? I mean, I know from our notes when Pecker spoke about Stormy Daniels, Trump was closing his eyes, moved his head from side to side. How did he react during testimony about McDougal? And why was he asking Pecker about her?
So I think at that point, Trump was asking the questions because there had been some amendments to the agreement. After the election, there had been an amendment to the agreement to allow Karen McDougal to speak to the press. And when Donald Trump found, and that is very significant, because again, it drives home the point, what was the purpose of this agreement? It was so that she would not speak to the press prior to the election. There was a campaign purpose here. The fact that she could speak after the election and that they made that deal just shows that it had nothing to do with really any other purpose. But the fact that she was then able to speak to the press, Donald Trump, when he learns about that amendment, was annoyed by it. Pecker testified he was very upset and said, well, what are you doing here? We're losing control of this. And so I think when Donald Trump was following up later, how is she doing? And Pecker's testifying she's quiet. It's, yeah, everything's fine. She's still under the contract. She's still getting promotional opportunities. She's happy. Don't worry.
So also Thursday, after Pecker's full day of damaging evidence, Trump had this reaction in the hallway. Let's take a watch. Oh, I'm so sorry, guys, that we don't have that at the moment. We do have it now. Let's roll it.
Today was breathtaking. This room, you saw what went on. It was breathtaking and amazing testimony. This is a trial that should have never happened. This is a case that should have never been filed. And it was really an incredible day. Open your eyes.
Challenging question here for you, Suzanne. You're able to add any context to breathtaking, amazing, and incredible?
Wow, just in terms of the testimony that happened?
Yeah, I mean, he's saying it was, but he's not interpreting it in the way that a lot of people would be interpreting it in terms of damaging to him, right? I mean, he's just trying to downplay how much this
that's what they were trying to do. I mean, I think the testimony was all of those things, but I don't think reflected very well on him. And I have to say, it's worth repeating that David Pecker was an incredible witness. He was steady Eddie. He answered every question. And it's interesting, for a guy who makes a living pretty much either strong-arming people and writing horrible things about people or making up stories, as we learned this week in court. He came across as very credible.
Okay, Christy and Suzanne, I'd like you to hang on, please, because we're going to talk about a key moment with David Pecker on the stand and the question that got everyone's attention. So.
We're watching history unfold right now at the Supreme Court, which heard arguments about putting the president on trial today. Historic, unprecedented. All the words are true about this one. No other president has been indicted like this. DOJ Special Counsel Jack Smith memorably charging Trump for the failed coup and the plots leading up to Jan 6. Trump's lawyers arguing he should be immune, basically totally immune, because he was president during those efforts. Now, that is a new, relatively made-up claim, which they lost unanimously before the respected D.C. Court of Appeals. You should keep that in mind, because that is the recent precedent and context for today. And you may remember that was the now infamous hearing where the Trump lawyer openly claimed that as president, Trump could have a license to kill American opponents. And that was the kind of chilling talk that many, many people across the spectrum rebuked then. That kind of talk was back today, with grave questions about murder and coups, and Trump's lawyers saying it's okay or it all depends.
Let's say this president who ordered the military to stage a coup
orders the military or orders someone to assassinate him. Is that within his official acts?
I think it would depend on the circumstances. It would depend on the hypothetical.
The case raises issues that go far beyond just a special counsel case.
One might argue that it isn't plausibly legal to order SEAL Team 6, yet the president uses it in an absolutely outrageous manner.
The court has to make decisions not just applying to President Trump, but also decisions that will apply to future presidents.
The president is entitled for total personal gain to use the trappings of his office without facing criminal liability.
His novel theory would immunize former presidents for criminal liability for bribery, treason, sedition, murder.
Here's what that means in plain English. I, Donald Trump, can do anything I want.
There's nothing to suggest that presidents need immunity because they've managed to do just fine for over 200 years.
Those are just some of the high points today. The Constitution does not say ex-presidents have immunity. Never has. Before Trump, no one even claimed that. After Trump, the courts now are full of prosecutions of his supporters and his aides. No indictments came just last night. And this is the obvious fact. The insurrection was a public crime spree. It was televised. It was live streamed by some of its participants. And now many of them are sitting in prison or awaiting trial. And those related election plots have been busted just the same. But many justices today seemed almost oblivious to that current reality and threat. Today was a historic day for the Supreme Court in the sense that we will be reading about this in history books. But I got to tell you off top tonight, I'm going to show you why and give you the breakdown. Today was also a depressing day at this Supreme Court, as its Trump appointees and some other members seemed oblivious to this reality of this insurrection era. Oblivious to the DOJ's victorious sedition convictions, which not everyone may follow, but judges and Supreme Court justices are supposed to track that. Those people who stormed the Capitol got their day in court, and many of them were convicted by juries of their peers. Other justices, though, did press Trump's lawyer on how the U.S. is supposed to deter or punish a coup or military coup if Trump's theory, if accepted, means a kind of total immunity.
Let's say this president who ordered the military to stage a coup, he's no longer president, he wasn't impeached, he couldn't be impeached, but he ordered the military to stage a coup, and you're saying that's an official act.
I think it would depend.
That's immune.
I think it would depend on the circumstances whether it was an official act.
Official act there is a stand-in for them saying it's okay. it depends. Well, by definition, it's not okay. A military coup would be against the official governance of the nation. If you can do a coup, can you do murder? That was the infamous part of the lower court's hearing I reminded you about. Today, Obama appointee Justice Sotomayor pushed Trump's lawyer on that violent, grim, authoritarian logic.
If the president decides that his rival is a corrupt person and he orders the military or orders someone to assassinate him, is that within his official acts that for which he can get immunity?
It would depend on the hypothetical, but we can see that could well be an official act.
There you have it, out in the open, before the highest court in the land. The current Republican Party nominee's lawyer defends murder and the assassination of Americans and just slaps the word official on it. That's how you know they're defending it, when they say, oh, it's official act. And says that should be something that the president can do. License to kill, total immunity. So here we are. Don't say they didn't warn you. We are hearing some of the most extreme authoritarian arguments ever presented to the Supreme Court in the modern era. I guess you could score one for transparency and say they're being pretty clear and transparent about what they're defending in the past and what they would do in the future. That's the Trump defense. Inside the courtroom today, Prosecutor Jack Smith watched the veteran litigator that he picked and sent in for this pivotal case, probably the most pivotal case on presidential power since U.S. v. Nixon. And that lawyer, when it was his turn, took a 2x4 to this Trump defense that I've been telling you about, saying this made-up immunity, if you did it, would protect and therefore encourage murder, treason, sedition. And again, sedition is, of course, what those Jan 6 attackers were convicted of.
His novel theory would immunize former presidents for criminal liability for bribery, treason, sedition, murder, and here conspiring to use fraud to overturn the results of an election and perpetuate himself in power. Such presidential immunity has no foundation in the Constitution.
That's true. The justices know if they say there's an immunity here, it will be a new thing, not an originalist thing from the original understanding of the Constitution, not a textualist thing from inside the text of the Constitution. I mentioned those are the prisms that many conservatives say they use on the court, except for apparently when they don't. There was no immunity under the law for Nixon. He took a pardon to avoid indictment, a basic sort of high school history class point against Trump that many people have thought about. Justice Jackson raised it very bluntly, and you'll be able to listen here, while other justices also appeared to root for Trump and reveal their leanings by musing about their opinion that pardoning Nixon may have turned out to be a good thing. And remember, your personal opinion about a thing that a president could do, Ford chose to pardon Nixon, he could have not pardoned Nixon. That opinion is not supposed to be how this court resolves the narrow legal question of whether the Constitution prevents DOJ from putting Trump on trial or not.
What was up with the pardon for President Nixon?
I think
if everybody thought that presidents couldn't be prosecuted, then what was that about?
We said, gosh, Nixon versus Fitzgerald, that's something courts shouldn't get engaged in because presidents have all manner of motives.
President Ford's pardon, very controversial in the moment.
Yes.
Now looked upon as one of the better decisions in presidential history.
Won't the predictable result be that presidents on the last couple of days of office are going to pardon themselves?
The last question is pretty cynical. Alito saying, if you allowed presidents to pardon themselves, wouldn't they all do it? Pardons are for criminals. No president has tried to pardon themselves, not even defended Trump. So it is odd for a sitting justice to ask if that would be the norm. Odd is a diplomatic word. It also sounds like yoga-level backbending to find some way to get Trump off the hook again. Now, the court's Republican-appointed majority was clearly warmer to Trump's arguments than those lower courts, which unanimously rejected them on a bipartisan basis. Critics say that shows the more obvious partisanship in this MAGA court overseen by Justice Roberts, who appears unable or unwilling to curb this red partisanship. But that does not mean that there were no good arguments for the legal claim of some kind of immunity, a limited presidential immunity. And I want you to understand the key points today. It was 2.5 hours, so we're not playing all of it. But I will show you one of the strongest arguments for that side came from a question also by Justice Alito. He asked if a president's bad ideas and official acts can be prosecuted, right? That's what Jack Smith is saying, that it should be able to be part of the case. He asked, then what about wartime acts like President Roosevelt interning innocent Japanese Americans, an operation that was first at the time deemed lawful? That's important for context. They were fighting the Nazis, they were fighting the Japanese, everything was on the line. But later, it was found to be unlawful by the Supreme Court itself, and as the war tempers cooled over the decades, it's widely viewed in civilized society as a racist and grave injustice. So Alito asked, given that history, wouldn't the door be open to prosecuting FDR or virtually any president for such official acts?
President Franklin D. Roosevelt's decision to intern Japanese Americans during World War II, couldn't that have been charged under 18 U.S.C. 241, conspiracy against civil rights?
Today, yes. President Roosevelt made that decision with the advice of his Attorney General. That's a layer of
safeguard. Is that really true? I thought Attorney General Biddle thought that there was really no threat of sabotage, as did J. Edgar Hoover.
Lawyers love to nerd out. Of course, the point's not what the AG said at the time or what Hoover said. The point is not whether it was signed off, but whether there is some outer limit, however far, on prosecuting a president for those official acts, which might have been taken in wartime good faith at one moment and later look like a war crime or a civil rights violation. That's a good question. Now, the Jack Smith rebuttal is, this ain't World War II. And Donald Trump's efforts were not on behalf of the U.S., not even a good faith but mistaken effort at national security. They were against the U.S. and its lawful election and its president-elect and his incoming administration at the time. Big difference. Now, one of the lowest moments today also came from Justice Alito, who asked a question suggesting that maybe America should just appease coup leaders. Don't upset them. Because if you do, or they're worried about being prosecuted for actual crimes, they might try to stay in power, stage a coup, end democracy. Bonkers. But I'm going to play for you the extreme premise of this question, where Justice Alito asks if a president worried about prosecution might be more likely to cling to power illegally. He says a stable democratic society requires a candidate who loses an election, even a close one, even a hotly contested one, leave office peacefully if that candidate is the incumbent. Let's take a listen.
If an incumbent who loses a very close, hotly contested election knows that a real possibility after leaving office is not that the president is going to be able to go off into a peaceful retirement, but that the president may be criminally prosecuted by a bitter political opponent, will that not lead us into a cycle that destabilizes the functioning of our country as a democracy?
No, it will not. Justice Alito is very intelligent, so based on my observation, I think it's more likely that he is trying to float this wild idea rather than really embracing it. Because to embrace the premise of that question, and they ask all kinds of questions, but the premise of that question is, gosh, we better be really afraid of people who might cling to power if they don't like being held accountable after they leave office after losing a lawful election, so let's not go down this road. It's called appeasement. It's dangerous when you do it to enemies, foreign or domestic. Why Justice Alito is using his perch on the Supreme Court to raise that today, only he can answer. But it is literally the opposite of the oath judges take to talk like that. Now, where is the court headed? I just went through a lot of the key points from this argument. The Supreme Court's conservative majority does seem poised to narrow the scope of the whole criminal case against Trump. That's how the New York Times viewed it today, reporting on what happened, and basically make it hard to conduct the trial before the 24 election. They also note that Trump's lawyer pressed an extreme version of the former president's argument, claiming presidential orders to murder political rivals or stage a coup could well be immune from prosecution. I quote that just to give you a sense of how this is playing. This is where we are in America right now. We are just almost normalized or casually discussing the talk of murder and coups. And there are many places in the world in history and right now, fewer in Russia, where that's just part of life. And you go on, you try to soldier through life knowing that Putin does murder Russians. That's what he does. But is that where we want to be here? Delays alone will give Trump most of what he wanted out of this case because he can punt this past the election year. And based on what the court said on the bench today, looks like he's going to get at least that, based on what they said. But before we bring in our guest tonight, I'm going a little longer than usual. I hope that's okay with you. I do want to put this in the wider framework of the problems we're facing. Because today is legally a dark day for this Supreme Court in what the justices didn't say and didn't deal with and didn't focus on. Very little of today's arguments dealt directly with the horrific insurrection at the center of this case, which is the DOJ Special Counsel Jack Smith's case against defendant Trump, which relates to a now convicted sedition. And so the longer you listen to these arguments today, the more you kind of got turned around away from this case and this reality. For all the hypotheticals about the future or what would happen with future presidents and all the history about presidents not named defendant Trump, the justices didn't focus much on the core reason there is a first ever federal prosecution of a president. He's the first one to try to steal an election and stop the peaceful transfer of power. You know this because he did it in public. He is legally presumed innocent. He deserves a trial. He might beat the trial. That's how we do it here under the rule of law. But that's how we got here. Not with hypotheticals about chilling a presidential act, not with wartime overreach, done perhaps on behalf of the United States, however wrongly. Not a president in the middle of their term trying to govern, but a defeated president, awaiting a president-elect. And for the first time in our history, don't forget it, violently stopping the peaceful transition of power with a sedition that's now been convicted. Now that's some facts that I've put together for you, but I'm also going to quote from a longtime Republican, Judge Ludwig. You may recall he testified on these very issues before Congress, and he had a tie to it in urging following the Constitution when he was dealing with then outgoing Vice President Pence. He observes how the court largely avoided these points I'm mentioning today, with arguments that discussed everything but the specific question presented. If a former president may be prosecuted for attempting to remain in power, notwithstanding the election of his successor by the American people, and thus depriving his lawfully elected successor of the powers of the presidency and preventing the peaceful transfer of power for the first time in American history. True. And while the court spent hours, I mean literally hours, pondering how a coup might involve official acts, Ludwig notes that and he knows it too, I should say, but he notes, and he wrote this today, that attacking Congress is not part of the president's job, to which we say, duh, and also sad that we have to do this kind of constitutional math. But he wrote, it is not a core power or function of the president to ensure the proper certification of the next president, the one in this case who beat him, President-elect Biden, by the Congress. That core point is not very complicated. Let me say it in English as I round out my reporting on today's case. Breaking the law is not enforcing it. Stealing elections is not protecting them. Committing voter fraud and elector fraud is not election integrity. Duh, again. Now, someday, there could be a tough case where the court does weigh potential prosecutorial overreach, against a president who was just doing their job or prosecuting a difficult war with second guessing afterward. But no disinterested expert seriously thinks that's the case here. Today, some conservative justices claim they have to step in, though, because there needs to be a rule for the future. Not about defendant Trump, they said, but for the future, later hypothetical cases. That's what they got to do. Well, as a longtime court watcher, I call bull. There's never been an insurrection like this before. The legal task at hand is how to prosecute it. Not to anxiously, neurotically cogitate about preventing a potential later overreach. This isn't an overreach, but someday they might be one. And so rather than dealing with this sedition, let's worry about this future overreach. And, oh, the people worried about it are the people appointed by, oh, the guy who benefited from this failed sedition. Huh. And then they keep insisting on the bench today, some of the Trump appointees, this isn't about him. They're bad at PR. When you say this isn't about the money, it sounds like it's about the money. And when you say this isn't about the guy who appointed me and our alliance and that we might help him get out of his jam and he might become president again so we can get more Trump appointees on the court, well, you sound pretty guilty in your mind. Now, if there is a later case, this is the kind of court that would probably take that case anyway, so they wouldn't even be stuck with some old rule, like okay to the coup prosecution, but the next one is out of bounds. And they say, oh, but we already made this ruling. Does anyone really think they're sitting out future big presidential cases? They'll say what they said in this case and the Trump ballot case. They take the case, sometimes they take it right in the middle of everything and say it's too important for them not to weigh in. And then, finally, I'm just disentangling their logic, just tonight, since they made these points today. Would they then be bound by this case? Again, if they said, okay for the coup prosecution, but we're worried about a later overreach, oh, we're bound by the earlier, narrower version of the thing we said. Would they be bound by this? Who knows? They certainly did not feel bound by Roe v. Wade. And they testified under oath they would uphold that precedent. So, forgive me for going on for some time. The arguments were longer than usual, approaching 3 hours. And while I mentioned there were some decent points made, some tricky questions, at the core, what we saw today was, best we could tell, many members of the Supreme Court shutting their eyes to the insurrection we lived through. Yes, Lady Justice is blindfolded. But the justices, we got a lot going on set, but everything's fine. Lady Justice is supposed to be blindfolded, but the justices are supposed to see the facts. And if you can't see the facts in front of you about this MAGA insurrection era, how can we possibly rely on you to prevent the future coups that we're told are being planned?
If the president decides that his rival is a corrupt person and he orders the military or orders someone to assassinate him, is that within his official acts that for which he can get immunity?
It would depend on the hypothetical, but we can see that could well be an official act.
You cannot make this up. Donald Trump's lawyer wants us all to think that ordering the military to assassinate a political rival could be seen as an official act of the presidency. Marcus and Ankush are back with us. We crazy.
I mean, for either of you, really, one of my biggest questions that as I've been watching this Supreme Court and others over the years is the discussion of executive power and how it's expanded. And it seems like this could happen here, right? If they push this down and then Trump becomes president, this case it's a wrap, right? His people have already said that. So I guess when you think about the historical implications of the expanded powers of the executive branch, how concerned should people be if that's what happens here?
I think that's what we've been seeing since Donald Trump was in office, is like tearing down the checks and balances on decisions that he was making. I mean, that's what he was trying to do with overturning the election. There are checks and balances of Congress to certify the election for a reason, and he was trying to subvert that by going to state legislatures or pressuring the DOJ. I mean, that has kind of been a theme since 2016. Yeah. And this is just a furtherance of that theme of now, look, we're talking about the credibility of the court here today. We're talking about the credibility of our elections. And these are all core institutions that keep our democracy going. And it's just literally been a continuing derivative effect since Donald Trump was first elected.
I want to start with you, Marcus, because you were in the room, but then I want your analysis on this too, Ankush, which is another court observer said to me that they had never seen Justice Roberts so uncomfortable.
It felt tense in there. And when I talked to my family afterwards, I said this felt like the first January 6th committee hearing, that first primetime hearing we did, where it felt you could just cut through the air. But that was because we wanted the American people to see that we got it right. It felt like the Supreme Court is hoping that it gets it right. And that's what I could tell. It just...
But wait, what is right? Is right by the law, or is right by
I told you, McGann, I hope they get it right by the law. But you could tell folks felt uncomfortable, or they felt the gravity of the moment.
What did they look like?
So you had certain justices who were like really leaned over, like not really looking at the advocates. You had others that were talking to each other. I mean, it looked like they weren't necessarily aligned on where this line should be, or if there should be a line at all. And that's why I thought some of these hypotheticals were so outrageous, because you felt that justices were putting markers in the sand of like, we cannot go this far. Like, we cannot say that we're in a monarchy. Justice Kagan brought up a monarchy. We cannot talk about having a coup. We cannot allow these type of powers to exist. And then you had the Chief Justice, as the other commentator said, kind of sitting there quiet. And Lord knows what was going through his mind, but this will be a decision that will live on forever.
Well, it's about the legitimacy of the presidency, it's about the legitimacy of the court, and it becomes about Robert's legacy.
It does. I mean, I think this has a real... I'm fascinated to hear all that, actually, truly fascinated, because maybe he's been reading some of the polling, and he realizes that this is actually a politically perilous situation for the Supreme Court. And yesterday, on Thursday, the scene must have been very uncomfortable for him. A third of the justices on the court were appointed by Trump. Thomas should not have even been there yesterday. He should be recused. His wife is a victim of the alleged crimes, having been duped by Trump and his allies' false claims of election fraud. Thomas should be recused, and yet he was there listening to this case. Again, it was a disgrace.
I'm just going to play this piece of sound. This is Justice Kavanaugh on the Nixon pardon. Okay, he had this exchange with a lawyer from the Justice Department who was representing the special counsel on Thursday.
President Ford's pardon, very controversial in the moment.
Yes.
Hugely unpopular, probably why he lost in '76.
Yes.
Now looked upon as one of the better decisions in presidential history, I think, by most people. If he's thinking about, well, if I grant this pardon to Richard Nixon, could I be investigated myself for obstruction of justice on the theory that I'm interfering with the investigation of Richard Nixon?
So this would fall into that small core area that I mentioned to Justice Kagan and Justice Gorsuch of presidential responsibilities that Congress cannot regulate.
One of our favorite presidential historians here, Michael Beschloss, he tweeted, "I don't think most people agree that there's not widespread agreement about the pardon of Nixon by Ford." But many other things came up in this conversation. Can a president pardon himself? Is that something we should be weighing in on here? And it was Justice Jackson that really, at the end, brought the conversation back to, why can't we just decide the question before us?
Yeah, you're exactly right to be asking that question. The thing I want to say is that framing, all of this framing about, we're setting a rule for the future, we're concerned about the hypotheticals, that is a deliberate choice. It is a deliberate choice that these conservative justices have made. They can and should have done what the D.C. Circuit did, which is address the allegations in the indictment and resolve the case that is in front of them. They are deliberately complicating this.
And that's a big difference between the lower court rulings and the Supreme Court. The questions from the Supreme Court was that the lower courts were focused on the crimes at hand. Can a president be immune for trying to overthrow an election? And to Ankush's point, we did not hear a lot of facts on Thursday at all about the crimes at hand. And Mr. Dreeben,
they said they didn't want to hear about them.
They said they didn't want to hear about them.
I don't want to get into the details of this case. Why are we here?
And I think that's concerning, right? Because they're talking about preventing this type of conduct in the future. And as many advocates have said, for 200 years, we haven't had this type of conduct in our country. And so why are we concerned about for the future? And I think, again, that just goes under the derivative effect of Donald Trump's actions in the presidency and the prospect that we could be looking at it again.
So if you are part of the 70% of Americans who agree that the president should not have absolute immunity, and then you watch what transpired this week in court, what is left as recourse, right? There's court reform, there's stacking the court. What do you see as the path forward? Because clearly something more structural is necessary.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think actually, as we think about this administration and its legacy, I think it will go down as having been a historic political miscalculation.
You're talking about the Biden administration.
The Biden administration to not have made a real earnest effort at Supreme Court to put together a commission that produced a report that nobody read. It was not a serious effort to actually pursue Supreme Court reform, and now.
Well, I would know because the President Biden, I mean, I worked for him at that time. I was a part of the transition, and I worked in the White House, and I know for a fact, and I mean, Eugene, you didn't ask him the questions too. I was there. He himself does not believe that is an avenue that should be explored. You know, Joe Biden is somebody that believes in the rules and laws and the systems. And one could argue, I honestly like, it's time to do things differently.
Well, look, I mean, yeah, I'm aware he has that view. He is holding the wrong view. I hate to say that about the president. He's been wrong about this the whole time. And now this court, over the last few years, is systematically running roughshod through our Constitution. In just the last few years, they've overturned Roe. They've invalidated affirmative action in higher education. They basically legalized same-sex discrimination. They threw out part of the Biden administration's signature domestic policy effort on the student loan forgiveness plan. And now they seem poised to issue some sort of ruling that will change the law, which had already been in place for a couple hundred years. We all assumed a president could be criminally charged after leaving office, to now come up with some crazy new doctrine. And
to say nothing of the Idaho case that they are listening to right now, which is like all of their chickens coming home to roost.
Oh, yeah, and it's like, we don't want to save women.
All of the cases coming back to them after Dobbs is a mess. And this immunity ruling, if it comes out as I think most of us kind of are expecting, it will go down in history as a practical effect, as a practical matter, as a sequel to Bush versus Gore.
No, I saw our good friend Andrew Weissman talking about the lower courts, what they can do in response, and that's just where I'm hoping it goes. Those of us, Ankush, I'm probably in your experience trying these evidentiary hearings, you actually can get more evidence in an evidentiary hearing before the judge than you can for a jury. And so if this is remanded, I hope that the American people can learn of the facts that
you are really our signature on
give us hope, Marcus.
I'm trying. I'm going to.
Let me ask you, Marcus, because sometimes when we talk about what happened at the court and you look at the volley, it gets framed as like it was not a good day for Jack Smith's team, right? Which was there anything Dreeben and his team could have done differently, or was this whole thing
absolutely
baked?
not? Ankush and I were talking about this before. Dreeben put on one of the better oral arguments I've ever listened to or witnessed.
He was excellent.
He was excellent. And in fact, was able to go where the court was going with these hypotheticals to his fallback position of going with Justice Barrett of like, that's a private act, we can try this case because another thing is in the outer perimeter. I mean, there was nothing he could have done. And I think that's why the justices spent an hour and 45 minutes with him and only just short of an hour with Trump's attorney, because he was that good on his feet. And I think they were trying to find the line that they can make this opinion with, which I think we all know it's probably going to be remanded for further proceedings. But I think they were trying to find that line of what's reasonable through Dreeben.
These are not the kinds of activities that I think any of us would think a president needs to engage in order to fulfill his Article 2 duties, and particularly in a case like this one. As applied to this case, the president has no functions with respect to the certification of the winner of the presidential election. The states conduct the elections. They send electors to certify who won those elections and to provide votes, and then Congress in a extraordinary joint session certifies the vote. And the president doesn't have an official role in that proceeding. So it's difficult for me to understand how there could be a serious constitutional question about saying you can't use fraud to defeat that function, you can't obstruct it through deception, you can't deprive millions of voters of their right to have their vote counted for the candidate who they chose.
Thank you, counsel.
Thank you, counsel. Welcome back to our primetime recap of today's Supreme Court proceedings on whether President Trump is immune from criminal prosecution for actions he took as president. It is also our primetime recap of the first full day of testimony from the blockbuster lead witness in the criminal trial of that same former president, which is ongoing right now in New York. We still have New York to get to. But on that point, from the Supreme Court arguments today, that discussion at the top there from Michael Dreeben, lawyer for the special counsel's office that has brought the federal prosecution against Trump for trying to stay in office after he lost the election. Dreeben is engaging there with the question of what counts as an official act by a president versus what's an unofficial act by a president. The reason he was engaging with that is because the conservative justices today, as Katie Fang, who was there, just was telling us, the conservative justices today kept putting that forward as the most important thing to be derived from today's argument. The next thing they wanted to do, the next step they wanted to take in this case. Not incidentally, a time-consuming, start-it-all-over kind of step that would have the practical effect of making absolutely sure that there's no chance Donald Trump stands trial before the election. That is what the Trump side wants. That seems to be what the hardline conservatives on the Supreme Court want as well. But while those conservative justices today were demanding that lawyers for both sides dance on the head of this particularly stupid pin, the more liberal justices did use today's proceedings to try to spell out what is just bluntly wrong with that. What seems crazy to normal people about the broadest strokes of what Trump is trying to do.
If there's no criminal prosecution, if there's no threat of criminal prosecution, what prevents the president from just doing whatever he wants?
All the structural checks that are identified in Fitzgerald and a whole series of this court's cases that go back to March 6th. For example, impeachment, oversight by Congress, public oversight. There's a long series that Fitzgerald directly addresses this in the civil context, and we think that language naturally ports.
I'm not sure that's much of a backstop, and what I'm, I guess, more worried about. You seem to be worried about the president being chilled. I think that we would have a really significant opposite problem if the president wasn't chilled. If someone with those kinds of powers, the most powerful person in the world, with the greatest amount of authority, could go into office knowing that there would be no potential penalty for committing crimes. I'm trying to understand what the disincentive is from turning the Oval Office into, the seat of criminal activity in this country.
I don't think there's any allegation of that in this case. And what George Washington said is, what Benjamin Franklin said is, we view the prosecution of a chief executive as something that everybody cried out against as unconstitutional. And what George Washington said is, we're worried about factional strife, which will.
No, I'm also. Let me put this worry on the table. If the potential for criminal liability is taken off the table, wouldn't there be a significant risk that future presidents would be emboldened to commit crimes with abandon while they're in office? It's right now the fact that we're having this debate because OLC has said that presidents might be prosecuted. Presidents from the beginning of time have understood that that's a possibility. That might be what has kept this office from turning into the kind of crime center that I'm envisioning. But once we say, no criminal liability, Mr. President, you can do whatever you want, I'm worried that we would have a worse problem than the problem of the president feeling constrained to follow the law while he's in office.
Right. Let me put this worry on the table, she says. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson today speaking plainly taking a step back to see the larger picture today. Keep saying how terrible it would be if the president was put on trial for his crimes. Can we also talk about how terrible his crimes would be and how terrible it would be for the presidency and for the country going forward if all future presidents knew they can commit any crime they want and there's nothing anyone can do about it? Chris Hayes, I was worried your head was going to.
Well, because I had the same
Yeah,
experience. I had the same experience listening to our arguments. I was like, yes, exactly. And partly it's because the Sauer, Trump's lawyer, and Trump himself and some of the conservative justices all seem to be agreeing on what we might call like the Dirty Harry model of the American presidency, which is like, you got to be tough, and maybe you got to break some legs, and like, maybe you got to shoot some bad guys, and like, what are you going to do? Bring your lawyers against me? Like, that was a consistent theme today.
Yeah.
They kept saying, Sauer kept saying, like, bold and decisive action. And one of the things Ketanji Brown Jackson brought up, which was another highlight of hers, which sort of pairs with that point, she's like, bro, there's lots of people with tough jobs out there. There's governors, there's the people that run the Pentagon. They all might face criminal prosecution. Somehow they manage to do their jobs. And actually, isn't it probably good that, like, they're going to do something and they go to their lawyer and be like, well, I get thrown in jail for this? Like, that seems like a good check. And I have to say, like, I was listening to that as someone who came up as a reporter in Illinois where, like, 4 of 11 governors went to prison. It was good that you might go end up in jail if, for instance, you sold commercial driver's licenses for bribes, as a former governor did when he was Secretary of State. Like, those were official acts. But, yeah, that sort of Damocles hanging over your head, probably a useful restraint when wielding great power.
Alex Wagner.
Can I just talk about, I mean, the first clip that you played, the idea that, as what did Sauer say, the official stuff has to be expunged. We need to have a separation here between the private acts and the official acts. A, I think it's quite clearly a delay tactic, but B, it does have me worried that this is the most likely outcome here, that this is remanded back to the district court and this whole new series of tests arises about what part of this is official, what part of it is private. I do worry about the integrity of the case that the prosecution's put forward here. And they sort of articulated that in court today, too. The agreement from the prosecution basically says this is an integrated conspiracy here, right? It has different components. And, you know, it's Donald Trump working with private lawyers to achieve the goals of the fraud. Once you start to unwind that arbitrarily, I guess, if the district court must, into separating private and official conduct, assuming any of it is official, I do worry about what that means for the case writ large.
Oh, yeah. And it slows it down for sure, and it may kill it altogether.
Well, and like if Lawrence is right, and there's a very likely possibility that Joe Biden wins, and this, you know, this ends up going to trial, you do have to think about, okay, what actually is the meaningful impact of this if it does see a court?
And also, don't we have to, at some point, answer the question that was asked? And that's what Ketanji Brown Jackson and Justice Jackson kept saying. Shouldn't we actually answer the question, does a president have blanket immunity? They were going all around trying not to answer it, but we actually need the answer to it. Because to your point, Matt and Rachel, now that we've given the theoreticals of a coup, killing your opponent, bribery, treason, murder, now that we've put it on the table where Trump can hear it, where he can see it and find it, don't we need to know, just in case he becomes president, whether he can kill people? Because he now knows that, in theory, he's got 4 or 5 people on the court who think maybe he can.
And the argument about that today was, well, we'll carve out an area of private acts only.
But privately.
And those ones they can be prosecuted for eventually someday. But it's going to be an elaborate test, and we're going to have to go back to the beginning.
Wait, and don't forget, you have to do impeachment and conviction before you can get to criminal prosecution.
Which has never happened in the history of the United States.
Ergo, the reason why they're creating even more of a higher, more impossible bar. It's not just put it.
That's a non-starter. Joy, you mentioned you're not a lawyer.
No.
But you sound like a good lawyer because that's what happens at the Supreme Court. There's a question presented, and it says, to what extent does a former president have presidential immunity from criminal prosecution for conduct alleged to involve official acts? Now, that word alleged is doing a lot of work. This question was already written. It was the first clue. Andrew Weissman and others mentioned this when we saw it. It was the first clue. They were leaning towards Trump. If you can allege your way, meaning it's not really an official act, you just allege it. Well, anyone can allege anything. If you watch the news or follow the law, I'm sure you've heard about that. What we're doing here is testing the evidence. There's been overwhelming evidence, which is why Jack Smith got this far. It's why he won this case at the district level. It's why he won it at the D.C. Circuit unanimously in a bipartisan set of appointees. The evidence has already been established to some degree. It doesn't mean Trump's guilty, but it means we're past that point.
Right.
If anyone can allege their way around, then this question and the test that the conservatives are pushing won't protect America.
How do you separate it? Giving out pardons is an official act the president is allowed
Article
to do.
2. It's an Article 2 power.
But if he
Pardon
sells
power.
the pardon and takes a bribe for the pardon, is it an official act?
The bribe part is private, but the pardon is not. I mean, that's the thing. Is it makes you have to take a holistic view of the integrated forms of
this
behavior.
isn't splitting the baby. This isn't splitting the baby. It's splitting the knife.
Well, we learned today that the United States Supreme Court has two different kinds of justices. Justices who are trying to protect the Constitution and the law, and justices who appear to be trying to protect the president, specifically the former president named Trump. That is the fundamental dividing line that seemed to emerge on the court today, with Justice Samuel Alito, as usual, running away with wild flights of fancy about what would happen to presidents if the Supreme Court doesn't provide them with some form of new protection that has never existed before. Justice Alito was placed on the Supreme Court, in effect, by the Supreme Court. When the Supreme Court decided in the 2000 presidential election in favor of George W. Bush, who came in second in the voting of the American people, but came in first in a 5-4 decision in the Supreme Court. Because George W. Bush, who lost the popular vote and was awarded the Electoral College by the Supreme Court, became president, he was then able to put Samuel Alito on the Supreme Court. Samuel Alito, in his opinion overturning Roe versus Wade, quoted judges in England long before the United States of America existed who were prosecutors of witches before they became judges who were then in the business of sentencing witches to death as judges. Samuel Alito thought they were worthy of quoting, in his opinion, removing the right to safe health care services in this country. Today, Samuel Alito imagined that without some new form of immunity written by the United States Supreme Court, every future president will be prosecuted by the new Justice Department that takes over after the president leaves office. In making that prediction, Samuel Alito was able to ignore the entire history of the United States of America prior to the criminal rampaging of Donald Trump in the White House. Justice Neil Gorsuch, whose seat on the Supreme Court was procedurally stolen by Republican Senator Mitch McConnell, who stole it away from President Obama's constitutional right to appoint the justice, held the seat open long enough so that Donald Trump could put Neil Gorsuch in that seat. Neil Gorsuch, who should be embarrassed every time he takes his seat on the Supreme Court, joined in the invented scenario of every president being prosecuted by the administration of his or her successor forever in the future. Even though that has only happened to one president, which proves that the one president those Republican justices care about is Donald Trump. They repeatedly tried to say that their entire concern was focused on the future, imaginary presidents, all of whom would appoint attorneys general who would become prosecutorial abusers of former presidents. Samuel Alito declared from the bench of the Supreme Court of the United States that the grand jury system in America does not work. It's one thing for flippant pundits on TV to use the overdone, cliched phrase about grand juries who will indict a ham sandwich if prosecutors want it. It is another thing entirely for a Supreme Court justice to say that same thing, to use that pornographic, legally, ham sandwich example in the Supreme Court, which is exactly what Samuel Alito disgracefully did from the bench of the Supreme Court today. He willfully insulted every member of every Trump grand jury that has returned every indictment against Donald Trump. The team of judges trying to protect Donald Trump today came up against the newest member of the United States Supreme Court who is trying to protect the Constitution. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson interrupted the questioning of Donald Trump's lawyer early in the hearing with this.
You suggested that the lack of immunity and the possibility of prosecution in the presidential context is like an innovation. And I understood it to be the status quo. I mean, I understood that every president from the beginning of time, essentially, has understood that there was a threat of prosecution, if for no other reason than the Constitution suggests that they can be prosecuted after impeachment. The Office of Legal Counsel has said forever that presidents are amenable to a threat of prosecution, and they have continued to function and do their jobs and do all the things that presidents do. So it seems to me that you are asking now for a change in what the law is related to immunity. Everybody has thought, including the presidents who held the office, that they were taking this office subject to potential criminal prosecution. No?
I don't. I see the opposite. I see all the evidence going the other way. Marbury against Madison, Mississippi against Johnson discussed this broad immunity principle that naturally.
So what was up with the pardon? What was up with the pardon for President Nixon? If everybody thought that presidents couldn't be prosecuted, then what was that about?
Well, he was under investigation for both private and public conduct at the time, official acts and private conduct.
Same with Donald Trump. Exactly the same. Later in the hearing, Justice Jackson imagined what could happen if the Supreme Court gives presidents even more legal protection than they have now.
If someone with those kinds of powers, the most powerful person in the world, with the greatest amount of authority, could go into office knowing that there would be no potential penalty for committing crimes, I'm trying to understand what the disincentive is from turning the Oval Office into, the seat of criminal activity in this country. If the potential for criminal liability is taken off the table, wouldn't there be a significant risk that future presidents would be emboldened to commit crimes with abandon while they're in office? Presidents from the beginning of time have understood that that's a possibility. That might be what has kept this office from turning into the kind of crime center that I'm envisioning. But once we say, no criminal liability, Mr. President, you can do whatever you want, I'm worried that we would have a worse problem than the problem of the president feeling constrained to follow the law while he's in office.
Well, it happened again. Stormy Daniels quashed Donald Trump. The breaking defendant Trump news of the night is that Stormy Daniels has humiliated Donald Trump once again, and while she was at it, she humiliated his criminal defense lawyers. Tonight, Judge Juan Merchan granted Stormy Daniels' motion to quash a subpoena from Donald Trump demanding a vast range of information about the making of a documentary film titled Stormy. The judge denied the Trump motion, saying this request is overbroad, seeks general discovery, and is not limited to the subject matter of this case. Judge Merchan had already quashed a subpoena for essentially the same material from NBC Universal, the producer of the documentary. The ruling by Judge Merchan came at the end of a day that began with a hearing about the district attorney's claim that Donald Trump has violated a gag order that prohibits him from, among other things, saying anything about jurors in the case. Prosecutor Christopher Conroy told the judge about a social media post that we reported as breaking news on this program last week. And the prosecutor noted what I noticed about it when we reported it here, that Donald Trump presented it as a quote from Jesse Waters at Fox, but in fact, Donald Trump rewrote what Jesse Waters said and added to that. So it was not actually a quotation of someone else. The district attorney Conroy told the judge, quote, "This is a very troubling post. At 5:46 p.m., the defendant published a post on his Truth Social account that stated, 'They are catching undercover liberal activists lying to the judge in order to get on the Trump jury.' That whole thing is in quotation marks. It's attributed to somebody named Jesse Waters. What Mr. Waters said was, 'They are catching undercover liberal activists lying to the judge,' period." So it is a hybrid of something somebody else said together with something the defendant apparently added on his own. I think the link to the jurors in this case, to this proceeding, I think it's very clearly a violation of your order of April 1st. Donald Trump's criminal defense lawyer, Todd Blanche, first tried to defend that post by Donald Trump by saying that it was a repost of what someone else wrote. But Judge Merchan would have none of that. Judge Merchan. It was posted on April 17th at 5:46 p.m. and it says, in quotes, "They are catching undercover liberal activists lying to the judge in order to get on the Trump jury," closed quote. And then it's attributed to Jesse Waters. Is that, in fact, what Mr. Waters said? Mr. Blanche, he said, "They are catching undercover liberal activists lying to the judge." And then not, at the time, I don't believe he said, "in order to get on the Trump jury." Judge Merchan. So your client manipulated what was said and put it in quotes. Am I right, Mr. Blanche? I wouldn't use the word manipulation, Your Honor, but the rest of the quote is not part of the quote. Judge Merchan, okay. My other question is, this is not a repost at all. Mr. Blanche, no. Judge Merchan, no. This is something that was said on TV, and your client had to type it out. He had to sit there, use the quotation marks, the shift key, and type everything out, and then add those additional words. So your argument that these are reposts and therefore they are not a violation, that does not apply to exhibit number 10, is it? Mr. Blanche, number 10 is not a repost. Agreed. Judge Merchan. So what is your argument as to exhibit 10? Mr. Blanche, Judge, the argument as to exhibit 10, it's ambiguous whether this statement violates the gag order. The gag order says Donald Trump is prohibited from making or directing others to make public statements about any prospective juror or any juror in this criminal proceeding. So Donald Trump cannot make any statement about a juror. No statement at all. That gag order wording could not be more clear. Donald Trump's criminal defense lawyer insulted the intelligence of the judge and everyone else in the courtroom when he then said, quote, "President Trump is being careful with your honors rules." And the judge interrupted, saying, "You, Mr. Blanche, you are losing all credibility. I have to tell you that right now. You are losing all credibility with the court." Now, you can spend years in a courtroom and never hear a judge say anything like that to competent lawyers. Judge Merchan said that he would rule on Donald Trump's violations of the gag order at some point after today's court session. And after Donald Trump left the courthouse, he put in writing a lie that he said when he arrived at the courthouse today and he spoke to the reporters gathered before he entered the courtroom. The in-writing version is more coherent than the loony version that Donald Trump said into the microphone this morning. So we will go with the written version at 4:35 p.m. today. Thousands of people were turned away from the courthouse in Lower Manhattan by steel stanchions and police. That is an absolute lie. I have walked down there several times. Traffic is free-flowing in and around the courthouse. Pedestrians, traffic is not hindered in any way. There was a large public gathering area in front of the courthouse where I saw exactly 3 Trump supporters gathered there yesterday. Early reports today said only 1 Trump supporter showed up, while the 85,000 Trump voters in Manhattan completely ignored what was happening at their local courthouse. Absolutely no one has been turned away anywhere in Lower Manhattan. It is actually much easier to approach and stand outside and gaze at Trump's courthouse than it is to see the Rockefeller Center Christmas tree in December, where the crowds and police barricades do indeed actually restrict access. Von Hilliard delivered today's best response to Percent Live on Twitter, saying, Trump just claimed that the police have shut down the streets around the courthouse for blocks and that his protesters can't be here. Just not true. There is one pro-Trump person here, and the main street along the courthouse is open to traffic. And Von Hilliard, of course, included this video in his Twitter post showing you just how easily vehicles move around and just how much of no one is actually there in support of Donald Trump. The truth is, Trump supporters do not care that Donald Trump is being prosecuted. They've made that very clear. He has begged them to show up, and they have refused. Yesterday, Donald Trump said, America-loving protesters should be allowed to protest at the front steps of courthouses all over the country. So there's Donald Trump summoning Trump supporters in Idaho to go to the courthouse in Boise and stage a big protest for him, or in North Dakota, or in Utah, or Alabama, or Texas, somewhere where there's a vast majority of voters for Donald Trump. Any courthouse in America, Florida, anywhere, and no one anywhere in the country showed up at any courthouse to protest the criminal prosecution of Donald Trump. 74 million Trump voters said absolutely no, we will not protest Donald Trump's criminal prosecution. We do not care. They aren't the only people who don't care. Donald Trump is the only criminal defendant I have ever seen who cannot round up a single family member to sit in the front row of the courtroom and support an criminal defendant, Donald Trump. His third and current wife isn't there. Neither of his daughters are there. None of his sons are there. Not a single personal friend has showed up as a show of support for Donald Trump. Not one. Serial killer and sometimes cannibal Jeffrey Dahmer had his parents in the courtroom every single day of his criminal trial. Every day. Donald Trump has less familial support than Jeffrey Dahmer had in the courtroom. What do you think was going through your uncle's mind in that courtroom, and what he might be thinking tonight?
First and foremost, probably thank goodness I only sit here for 3 hours today. But other than that, he must know that it's not going well. And one of the things that I find really quite interesting is the extent to which he seems incapable of connecting with the jury. So I'm going to be very interested in seeing how that plays out. But more than anything else, Lawrence, and I know other people have commented on it, but it's incredibly important. It's the extent to which has no control over the situation, and he needs control in order to project the image that he's been able to project for so long. Without that control, it all falls apart. I mean, we know that Donald is a very weak person, or at least some of us know that, and that his ego is a very fragile thing that needs to be bolstered at every moment. He needs the rallies. He needs the applause in the dining room at Mar-a-Lago, because he knows deep down he's nothing of what he claims to be. You know, he's just this frightened little boy. But with the help of a lot of smoke and mirrors and sycophants, he's been able to convince other people and himself that he's actually a successful, tough killer. And, we hear that word come up, but it's a very important word in Donald's psychological history. And without the control, without being able to control the lighting or the temperature, without being able to leave or use his phone without permission, which he probably wouldn't get, it all starts to unravel. And what I think we're going to see in terms of his desperation in his hallway rants before and after, and his inability to stop glaring at people, or his inability to connect with the people who have, in some sense, his future in their hands, that he can't kid himself anymore about his power and his place and his privilege. And what's probably even worse, he can't kid anybody else either, and he knows it.
I have the feeling he's always been wrong about how he comes across to people, by which I mean, I know some people were completely charmed by him and liked him. And I mean this in the pre-politician era. But he always came across as, just as Spy Magazine called him, a vulgarian, which I always thought was the perfect, if you were allowed a single adjective about Donald Trump. This is a very, very small-minded vulgarian, and certainly what I've always thought about him. He could never have, charmed me in any way, and most people I know. But he doesn't know that. He never had any idea that there were people who were not just immune to him, but took an active dislike for what he obviously represented. And so his disconnect from the jury must also include this mistake he's made his whole life of thinking that everybody thinks I'm great.
Yeah, and listen, he's had a lot of help. Fragile systems bend towards the most dysfunctional person in them. And we've seen this time after time in Donald's life. The ground zero for this was my family, of course. And then it was the Republican Party. And then it was the DOJ, both in his administration and in President Biden's administration. Time after time after time, we've seen that people in those systems make a choice, whether it's Aileen Cannon or Bill Barr or the Supreme Court or Merrick Garland, whether it's out of fear or favor, they intentionally or not, consciously or not, come down on the side of protecting or elevating Donald Trump. So it's not any wonder that he would think that he would be able to control any situation he's in. And that's why we're going to be seeing some very potentially disturbing behavior from him in the courtroom and outside of it. And, after 4 or 5 days, it's already manifesting itself.
Yeah, I mean, he's attacking the jury tonight. He's attacked the jury once before in a direct violation of the gag order on him. And that's the first thing the judge has to rule on tomorrow, is how much has Donald Trump violated that gag order.
Yeah, and Judge Merchan is in a similar situation in deciding what side, I shouldn't put it that way, what kind of decision he's going to make. Is he, as Andrew Weissman suggests he should, not going to judge out of fear or favor? And that's what should happen, because the whole idea that Donald is a victim here of anybody but himself, or the whole idea that the system is rigged against him and that it's much more fair to everybody else, is just laughably absurd, of course. And it's about time that this madness stop, because we know that Donald endangers people's lives. And we know that as you pointed out earlier, we've already seen that there are jurors who are understandably quite concerned about how this trial and their participation in it, their willingness to do their civic duty, may put themselves in harm's way, which is just unacceptable.
So Donald Trump's defense lawyer, Todd Blanche, said this in his opening statement today. He's not just Donald Trump that you've seen on TV and read about and seen photos of. He's also a man, he's a husband, he's a father, and he's a person, just like you and just like me. Now, I don't know why he didn't include uncle, since you're out there, but so this point about he's a husband and a father, that's the first time, and I've been in a lot of criminal courtrooms watching trials, that's the first time I have seen a criminal defense lawyer describe his client as a husband and a father without having the wife and the children in the front row of the courtroom. This is something that I've never seen not actually made manifest in the courtroom before. Donald Trump's in that courtroom alone. Jeffrey Dahmer's parents were there every single day. It is very hard to find a courtroom where the criminal defendant doesn't have a relative sitting there in the front row.
Yeah, well, a couple of things about that. First of all, it's another example of how he perverts systems or expectations. For anybody else, that would just be damning, right? Just the way he talks about dogs would be damning. How many times have we heard that his bizarre behavior, that he engages in bizarre behaviors or just doesn't conform in a way that a reasonably well-adjusted human being would, but like everything else about him, it just kind of gets baked in, right? But it's worth pausing about how unfair, unreal, bizarre, strange, unacceptable, weird, whatever adjective you want to use, it is that he is there alone in terms of friends and family. I think it is worth pointing out, one, I don't think he cares. I don't think it matters to him. That is not where he gets his energy. That is not what gives him solace to the extent that anything does. He's more upset about the fact that there aren't more people outside protesting on his behalf, right? But it also points to the bizarre thing about my family, that every transaction in this family is a transactional one. I'm sorry, every relationship, I should say, is a transactional one. His kids have decided, for whatever reason, that it's not worth their time for them to be in that courtroom because they're not going to get anything out of it. That's the way this family rolls.
Hey everyone, MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.
A clarion call to, quote, walk back from the edge of the abyss. That's from conservative stalwart Liz Cheney just last night at an event in Iowa. Liz Cheney had scathing words, not just for her own party for, quote, abandoning the Constitution, but also for the United States Supreme Court, the nation's highest court, for potentially paving the way for Donald Trump to avoid going to trial for an attempted coup plot against the United States government. Cheney urging the Supreme Court to grasp exactly what it is doing by slow-walking the Trump immunity case, where he is claiming that he's immune from prosecution for the insurrection because he was acting in his capacity as president. Listen to that.
I think it's very important that the Supreme Court recognize that what he's doing is a delaying tactic, and that the American people, it cannot be the case that a president of the United States can attempt to overturn an election and seize power, and that our justice system is incapable of holding a trial, of holding him to account, before the next election. That cannot be the case. Taking action that will result in further delay in preventing the American people from seeing that evidence in open court is itself suppression of the evidence, that the American people have a right to see that evidence, and the court ought to recognize that.
It cannot be the case that our justice system is incapable of holding him accountable. From Liz Cheney. She's talking to you, Supremes. She's saying that there is a threat that the courts are now enabling Trump from to avoid all legal accountability and political accountability from the voters. Because more than 3 years after the insurrection, the voters do not have access to a full accounting of what happened. And they won't see that in a court of law. Donald Trump is one step closer to the presidency now, thanks to a political party that has nominated him and continues to enable him. Here's what Cheney had to say about that to her fellow Republicans.
It created a situation where I think voters thought, well, you know, it must not be that he's that dangerous, because if he were, then, you know, you would have more people saying so. And look, I think the Republican Party leadership itself had to make a choice. Many times they were faced with a choice between doing what was right, between furthering the democracy and the Constitution, or embracing Donald Trump, and they chose Donald Trump.
Cheney also saying that people should make no mistake. A second Trump term will not look anything like the first Trump term. There will be no more adults in the room. No one in the administration will stand in the way of Trump shredding the United States Constitution. Instead, Trump, by his own admission, will install crackpots, more than willing to do his bidding.
It's important to recognize, for example, what it would mean to have a president who refused to abide by the rulings of our courts. And when, you have a situation where the reason that our courts have the power that they do and that they have to have under our Constitution is because the chief executive enforces their rulings. The courts can't enforce their own rulings. And all you have to do is listen to what Donald Trump says, look at the filings that his lawyers have made in the immunity case and others. The moment that the court rules in a way he disagrees with, he will just ignore it. He'll refuse to abide by it. I think that's also important for people to understand. He will appoint people who will do his bidding. He will appoint people, and if they are nervous about doing his bidding, he'll offer them pardons. And he won't leave office. I mean, just think about, we know he tried once not to leave office. And he will have no incentive to guarantee a peaceful transfer of power and to leave office if he's elected again.
A high-power Republican joining a now bipartisan, all-hands-on-deck effort to protect our democracy and prevent an unrestrained Donald Trump from ever returning to power is where we begin today. Former Trump White House communications director and host of the podcast Open Book, Anthony Scaramucci, is here for a triumphant return. We tried this once many, many moons ago, many lifetimes ago, I think, for both of us. We're thrilled to have you back. Thank you. Also joining our conversation, MSNBC contributor and columnist Charlie Sykes is here. And with me at the table for the hour, Democratic strategist and director of the public policy program at Hunter College, Basil Smikle. Anthony Scaramucci, it's a pleasure to have you back here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Nicole.
You've been a part of something that I really appreciate. I think you have, and you correct me if I get this wrong, but you seem to have tried to coax out of the corners or hiding some of the people who have been reluctant to enter the political fray, to offer their firsthand accounts of the danger that Donald Trump poses. Why is, and I have a little sense that that's a very difficult, painstakingly a diplomatic process. Why is it so hard for some of these people to speak out? They're some of the most alarmed people among us.
Well, they probably don't like death threats, Nicole. I think we could probably start there. And so, I mean, that could be the number one reason. But ultimately, I think with the generals, it has to do with their respect for the dignity of the Constitution and not wanting to bring military leadership into the political fray. But at the end of the day, what Liz Cheney is saying is so true and is so alarming that if we don't do it, I don't know who will do it. And I'm certainly worried about everything that she is saying. I just want to add one thing quickly. He will be way more organized this time. One of the reasons why that insurrection failed is that he didn't have the organizational skills. He doesn't have the executive management skills to run an insurrection properly. But he now has willing participants on that campaign that are way more organized than him. And so do not underestimate that, and do not underestimate their effectiveness going forward if he should somehow win, which I predict he won't.
He's also, Anthony, studying best autocratic practices. I mean, he spent time with Orban, and he is seemingly modeling a second term around something distinctly un-American. What is your sense of what, if any, preparations are underway in the private sector to prepare for what happened to the private sector in Hungary as Orban ascended?
Well, listen, I think it's a very good point. He wants to be in that axis of autocracy. He signals to these dictators that he's one of them. He's looking for their help in terms of understanding their profile, what they do to press freedoms, what they do to business leaders in order to coerce them into their plutocracy, if you will, which ultimately becomes a kleptocracy. So he's there. He's got willing participants. He's got their playbook, but frankly, he has his own playbook. I think the startling thing for Mr. Trump was he couldn't believe that he lost that election. And lest anybody forget, he knows, Nicole, and I just want to repeat this, he knows he lost that election. He tells the insiders that all the time. He just likes to keep that ruse going so that he can get willing participants to fund his legal expenses and fund the campaign. But again, good news, money's drying up for him. Lots of business leaders don't want to be affiliated with him, and the small donors are drying up as well, and that bodes well for the president.
I mean, you just described, really one of the most cynical things that happens in politics. He's spoofing his own, or punking, whatever word you want to use, his own base, that he knows what we know, which is that Joe Biden won fair and square. And the purge of people like lifelong Republican Chris Krebs, and the attacks on Mark Milley, and the attacks on Bill Barr are all because he needs to keep the lie going. One, to raise small dollar donations from the base, and two, to keep them enraged. Do you think that, what is the best way to make sure that they know that he doesn't even believe the things he tells them?
Well, we got to go outside of the mainstream media. We've got to go directly to them. I plan on spending a lot of time in the swing states this fall. Conservative talk radio is a good place for it. Remember, I grew up in a blue-collar neighborhood, so a lot of these guys, it's hard for them to outmaneuver me in places where I grew up. And we gotta talk to them straight. And, since you're talking about Republicans that have failed the country, let's just mention Kevin McCarthy before you turn to another guest. This spineless guy, Kevin McCarthy, who I gave money to as a fellow Republican, and I know personally, could have put Trump through the ropes on the 7th of January. He had the votes to impeach him and roll it into the Senate, and they could have convicted him there. And we would not see the likes of Donald Trump. And then we could talk about how we're going to heal the Republican Party and re-strengthen our democracy. But because of his profile and cowardice,